Now on BBC Two, live coverage from the House of Commons of the 2003 budget, introduced by David Dimbleby.
Welcome to Downing Street, number 11, where the Chancellor does his work, and this year's budget, which is going to be given against the background of war, with all the uncertain effects on our economy and the world economy. And with Gordon Brown having to answer a difficult question, how he's going to find the money for all the spending increases announced already over the next few years. We're going to be finding out today about business and manufacturing and what effect they think the budget will have on investment and jobs. We're going to try and find out whether the new spending on the NHS and on other public services is starting to come through to the consumer. And we're going to be hearing from the City of London whether they're a bit more confident when the Chancellor sits down than they were when he stood up. And from the Working Lunch team, Adrian Chiles is going to be assessing the effect of this budget on individuals. Adrian.
Good morning to you. We'll be trying to boil the budget down to the bits which really bother you when it comes down to it, i.e., is the Chancellor, is Gordon Brown going to make you richer or poorer? Now, we've got 24 people in 6 studios around the country. We're calling these our budget barometers, to give the Chancellor the thumbs up, the thumbs down, or indeed any other hand gesture they might deem appropriate once they've heard the speech. Also, we've got experts on hand who know everything there is to know about tax, savings, benefits and pensions. So join us later.
Thanks, Adrian. We'll bring you those hand gestures in close-up. Changes in the way the House of Commons works means that we're here much earlier in the day than usual because they've changed all the timetable round. Prime Minister's questions are going to be first at midday. Prime Minister will be there answering questions, no doubt, about Iraq. And then at 12:30, the Chancellor gets up for the budget. And when he sits down, we then hear straight away from the Leader of the Opposition. He'll be launching the Tory attack on Labour proposals. Then, with the help of all our experts, we'll get a good idea of what to make of the changes, what the political effect will be. And if you want to comment, or if you want to ask them questions, you can email us right now. The address is budget@bbc.co.uk, budget@bbc.co.uk. No sign of the Chancellor of the Exchequer outside number 11 rather at the moment. But Andrew Marr, our political editor, this is the year when he thought he might be coming out of number 10 rather than number 11 as Prime Minister, isn't it? And
absolutely. Not only that, I mean, it was only a few weeks ago that everyone was talking about the great split in the Labour Party. If things went badly in Iraq, could Tony Blair survive? You know, might there be some dramatic change to the shape of the government over the next few months? Has to be said, what a day to have a budget on, with Baghdad in absolute chaos, scenes of jubilation. It is quite extraordinary. Gordon Brown could come out of that door and he could announce he was abolishing income tax, that he was getting rid of sterling and we were going to join the US dollar, and he still wouldn't make the headlines tomorrow.
What about if he went into the House of Commons and said he'd done the tests on the euro and he'd decided that Britain shouldn't join?
Very interesting. I believe there has been a serious discussion very recently about whether to do just that in this budget. They've decided against too much turbulence, too much turmoil in Iraq and indeed in the world markets, they thought. But they were very close to doing that, and I think it won't be long before they do.
Evan Davis, our economics editor, do you think the Chancellor's a worried man today?
I think he is a little worried. He's on the cusp of moving from looking a little unlucky to looking a little careless, because he's had to come back in the pre-budget report and say my forecasts were wrong, I was too optimistic. He's going to have to do the same again, and that is twice in a row. And now he faces the terribly difficult dilemma of should he play it optimistic again and just hope all these problems evaporate, or should he really try and get the pessimism out of the way, downgrade everything so that from now on he's not going to have to risk coming back again with this sort of sorry guys, I was too optimistic last time.
Okay. DeAnne Julius, as an economist, and you were a founder member of the great monetary committee that decides interest rates way back at when Labour came in. Well, I don't, not too far back. I'm not talking before the hour. Now, what do you believe the state of the economy is, and what light is Gordon Brown going to throw on it? Is he going to be trying to cheer us all up a bit because Some people are a bit gloomy about things.
Well, I think the economy is in pretty fragile state. There's no doubt about it when you look at what profitability has done. It's at the lowest rate it's been for 10 years. The consumer sector is weakening, although still not weak. So I think there are a number of serious weak spots in the economy. I don't expect the Chancellor will focus on those. I suspect he'll focus on the big picture, the aggregate numbers, which look considerably better because of some strong spots.
Okay. Well, Jeff Randall is at Barclays Capital at Canary Wharf in the city. Jeff, what's the city make of this Chancellor now?
Well, they've had a long time to live with him, haven't they, David? 6 years and 7 budgets. And I think that the mood has changed dramatically from the early days. In the early days, they were quite enamoured of the Chancellor. They loved his move to make the Bank of England independent, and they really enjoyed his emphasis on prudence. This is what the city wants to hear. But I think that they feel that that love affair between the Chancellor and prudence has slipped somewhat in recent times, and they now feel he's having an affair with a rather high-maintenance girl called Education and Health. And they are worried that the spending on education and health is running out of control and that the numbers don't add up anymore. Chancellor
just appearing now on the pavement with his budget box, with his staff around him. Andrew, he doesn't look, he looks rather exhausted, doesn't he? He doesn't look very cheerful.
A lot of people have said that in recent weeks and months he's put on a bit more weight, he's looking a bit tired and so on. He is, of course, an expectant father again, so a bit of good news for him. Will be interesting to see if that's reflected in anything he does in the budget.
Paul Boateng, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury,
right,
on the left there, and Dawn Primarolo, the Paymaster General, on his right, or on his left, right of the picture.
Red
and of course,
Dawn, as she used to be known.
Missing is Sarah Macaulay, his wife, who... Chancellors used to go with their wives for a walk in the park, didn't they? But I don't think he did that this year. He went to the Churchill buildings or something and to open them.
I think the walking stopped during Nigel Lawson's time. I can't remember whether there was a marital reason for that or whether there was an overweight reason for that. He seemed to stop doing it. And Gordon has not been a great walker.
Jeff Randall, what do they down in the city hope is going to be in that red box?
Well, do you know what? I think the traders here behind me, they feel a bit like those people who would buy a pound lottery ticket on a Saturday morning. They're hoping for the best, but they don't really expect anything good to turn up. I think that the very best that they can hope for in terms of business is a neutral budget. They'd really hate to see any more taxes. And they're really worrying that those borrowing numbers are not going to be worse than has already been speculated about. If they are, I think the markets will become very edgy.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. We'll come back to you afterwards. Well, as I said, we're going to be trying to interpret all this and its meaning. And it's not just the actual facts and figures, it's what the public, the voters, make of them and what the consumer makes of them. The increases, for instance, in spending, which the Chancellor confirmed in his November statement, and some which were announced last year, big spending on the NHS. We know that the cost of that is already coming through, 1% on national insurance, which happened this week. But despite all that, unless the public actually get the sense that things are getting better, aren't complaining that the money is being wasted, it doesn't do the government much good. So what's the record so far? We join Zainab Badawi. Zainab.
Well, David, we're a little windswept here, but worth it for the views. Let me put that point directly to somebody from the front line, Beverly Malone, leader of the nurses. Do you think the extra money that's going into the NHS will deliver a better service for patients?
Yes, it will, because it's going to attract and keep more nurses, and that's definitely going to affect the delivery of quality care to patients. We're delighted that it happened.
And so when you say that, does that mean that you see the point of the extra money as delivering better pay for nurses?
I definitely do. There's a proposal that nurses are right now considering about increasing their pay and increasing a better career structure for nurses, and all of this is part of that budget.
But it's not all about pay, is it? I mean, people out there are going to say, well, yes, maybe the nurses should get extra money, but what about us? Is it going to mean we get better care?
Nurses will definitely be there to give care. If there are not enough nurses in the system, the care can't be delivered. And this helps to attract nurses and keep them in the system that will deliver better care to patients.
Well, as you were saying, the government at the moment is negotiating with people in the NHS in this new pay structure called Agenda for Change,
yes.
A huge shake-up of pay for NHS staff. But people might say, well, hang on, is an awful lot of the money going to go into salaries? I mean, across the board, there are going to be increases of 16%.
Yes, well, an investment in patient care is an investment in nursing, and nursing is so connected to the delivery of care to patients that we have to make sure that those nurses are there. If they're not there, care can't be delivered. So I'm sure that patients will know that they need nurses right there available.
Mark Stoker, the government plans to spend about £105 billion on the NHS within the next 5 years. Now, you as a defence economist must see the £3 billion which the Chancellor is allocating to the war. It's really dwarfed, isn't it? I mean, can we afford the £3 billion?
Well, I think in the short term the answer is yes. The direct cost of the war, as you say, will probably come in something like maybe as much as £3.5 billion. Probably of more interest is what's going to happen in the longer term when we get into reconstruction and peacekeeping forces, and also the wider effect that the war may be having on the economy.
Huge temptation, isn't there, for the Chancellor to pin all the economic woes on the war, surely?
Well, I think there is. I don't think he will. The budget deficit this year is likely to be in the order of £30 billion. As I said, the direct cost of the war at $3 billion is only 10% of that. So he'd struggle to blame all of his problems on the direct consequences of the war. However, he may get some mileage out of blaming the fall in consumer confidence and business confidence as a knock-on.
Has he left enough money in the coffers then?
Yes, I think he has got enough money in the short term.
Mark Stoker, thank you. Beverly Malone also. Well, there you are, David. The Iraq war seems, at least to Mark Stoker, eminently affordable.
Zainab, thanks very much. We'll be talking about that here as well in a moment, and I think rather sharing that view. But of course, budget day, the other thing is, what does business make of it, big and small? Rob Pittam is at the Gripple Wire Production Company in Sheffield. Rob.
Gripple, David, it sounds like a very traditional, solid manufacturing name, doesn't it? But there's nothing actually that traditional about this company. For one thing, it's doing quite well at the moment, and that's certainly unusual in the manufacturing sector. For another, just take a look at the building. This is the old Sheffield Gunworks. The building dates back to the 1840s, and it was actually derelict until this company took it over about 5 years ago. And with its kind of stripped back brickwork and its high glass windows, it looks like the kind of place you'd find some trendy marketing or PR firm. But instead, what's actually made here is this. This is a gripple. It's a device for joining wires together or for suspending things from wires. Take, for example, that skeleton, which is rather tastefully hanging above the shop floor here. That's being suspended by a gripple. Now, this company, as I say, is doing extremely well at the moment. It exports about 85% of its products abroad. And despite these very attractive surroundings, it's actually building a new factory too, so things go extremely well. It began back in 1998, so it's always really been under a Labour government, under Gordon Brown, really. So, Chris Middleton, you're the MD. What kind of Chancellor has he been for you?
Well, over the last 5 years, we've seen sustainability in terms of low inflation and low interest rates. That's been very good. That's allowed us to plan our business going forward. Strategic planning has been very good. We need to see a lot more of that. Also the R&D, we've had 150% relief on R&D costs. That's very important to our business.
Okay.
In terms of future investment.
Okay, Chris, thanks very much. We'll be hearing more from Chris in a moment, but we're going to get a broad section of the manufacturing opinion. Chris Ray is also a manufacturer here in Sheffield. How's things going for you, Chris?
Very well at the moment, thank you.
What kind of Chancellor have you had? Is he doing a good job, you think, or a bad job?
Well, I don't think we manufacturers have enjoyed any budget for the last 20 years, and the last one was particularly bad. We're about to pay the £85,000 extra national insurance bill this year. Hopefully we won't see anything as severe this time.
Okay, Chris, you'll be watching the budget carefully, but it's not just about manufacturers today. We've actually got a cross-section right across the business community. We have three more guests over here. With Nagat, who's got a chain of Indian restaurants and Indian sauces too. Now, Nagat, how's business for you at the moment? What kind of climate are you working in?
God, business is not easy at the moment. It's a very hard climb, but let's see what the budget brings today. At the end of the day, we want to help the employers help us, and we want to put into what we can. We want to help businesses. Small businesses become big, and the only way we're going to do it is with the government helping us. For example, where's the youth training scheme gone? Where are the training young people?
So plenty of questions. Jen, you have a small firm that employs 3 people in human resources. What are your concerns?
We want to be able to be helped with the training element, like it's just been said. And we help to create small businesses as well, and that's happening quite a lot in South Yorkshire. There is a lot of funding with Objective 1 to do that, so we would like to see more of that. But we would also like a reduction in red tape for small businesses.
Red tape too. And John, you're from the Amicus Union. What's your union looking for?
Well, we're quite unequivocally looking for a budget on manufacturing. On a daily basis, we're dealing with plant closures and redundancies. The Chancellor talks a good game on manufacturing, but it's not delivered so far. We want to see capital investments lifted to 100% on plant and manufacturing.
Sean, thanks very much. We'll be coming back to you later on. Plenty of things on the wish list of these companies. We'll be seeing that the Chancellor can deliver. David.
Thanks very much. Evan, a curious thing. I mean, manufacturing industry is meant to be skirting recession effectively, and yet the two manufacturers there seem very cheerful and chipper about it all.
We had a range of views there. I mean, they clearly found the remaining manufacturing industry in the country. No, it's a very difficult time for manufacturers. That is not altogether Gordon Brown's fault. That has been the end of having a 5-year period of a very, very high exchange rate that makes it extremely difficult to compete internationally.
Lots of jobs lost in manufacturing.
Oh yeah, we have been going through a very big transition in which hundreds of thousands of jobs have been transferred from the tradable manufacturing sector to the service sector. But that has been a very long-term process.
Let's just talk about this war costs. Mark Stoker said a moment ago to Zainab that he didn't think the war was important. Now, I can see that a Chancellor might want to suggest that it is important in his failure to make the economy or his budget balance. How important is it in your view?
I don't think it's going to provide much of an alibi for him. Let's have a look at the figures. Back in November, the Chancellor announced $1 billion to the cost of the war. Back in February, he announced another $750 million, and then a couple of weeks ago, he said he was allocating a total of $3 billion. At the time, we said it could end up being quite a lot more than that. I think now that the war looks like it's all but over, the question is not so much the cost of the war. What I'm interested in hearing from the Chancellor is the cost of the peace, what Britain is going to have to allocate to humanitarian aid or reconstruction.
I mean, $3 billion by any account looks a lot of money.
It looks a lot of money. That is about £50 for every man, woman and child in the country. Put it in the context of overall public spending, and you see that it actually is very small. The NHS costs $75 billion a year, so a $3 billion war would simply run the NHS for 2 weeks. Social Security, $110 billion, or overall public expenditure, $455 billion this year. That tells you that the Chancellor is not going to get away with saying this war has upset my calculations dramatically.
DeAnne, what about the effect of war on the global economy, which we all in the end depend upon, on trade and all that? I mean, is it a worrying moment?
It is a worrying moment. It's partly because of the war, but actually you have to remember the US economy entered this war with very little momentum. World trade was already very slow, so we've been slowing down ever since the year 2000. The war hit us at a rather bad time when confidence is fragile, and therefore businesses are naturally delaying investment. But it's not just the war. There are a number of other underlying problems in the economy that won't be resolved when the war's over.
Jeff Randall was saying that the city had kind of given up on its love affair with the Chancellor because they thought he was getting things wrong. Is he getting things wrong? Is it his fault that he's going to be standing there reducing his forecasts, or is it the world outside largely?
Well, I think that the world outside has not turned out the way he hoped it would. Now, we can all be wrong in our projections, so there's nothing new about that. But on the other hand, in last year's budget, the Chancellor did take two very big gambles. He gambled that our economy was going to improve this year, and it's gone the other direction. And he gambled that this very big increase that he's put in spending on health and education would deliver the goods sooner rather than later. And it looks as though he's at risk of losing both those gambles.
And if he says, just one last thing, if he says, as he's expected to say, but we're much better than France, we're much better than Germany, you know, this country's doing really, really well. Is that true? I mean, is it a better time to be living in Britain economically than in France or Germany?
Well, it's true in a numerical sense. I think he is right that our growth rate is higher this year than it is in those countries, probably will be higher next year. But that's a rather superficial view. I think then one has to look underneath that and say, why are we growing faster? Is it because we're fundamentally in better shape and more competitive? I don't think that's it. Or is it because we're in the midst of quite a big housing market bubble and there's a lot of public sector hiring, both of which could easily be gone by next year?
And I suppose, as with all figures, it all depends where you start from.
Exactly.
Let's join Adrian Chiles again now in the Working Lunch studio, and let's hear more from those families who he was briefly talking to, whose change in income as a result of this budget we're going to be measuring.
We've got a couple of dozen volunteers in 6 studios around the country. These are the group we always somewhat patronisingly referred to as the ordinary people. We can't think of another way of describing them. So, ordinary people, would you mind giving us a wave, please? There we go, bags of enthusiasm, that's what I like to see. These men and women, whether they know it or not, are actually representative of the population as a whole in terms of their age, marital status, income, number of kids they have or haven't got, and so on. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, which knows about these things, told us the kind of people we needed, and we've gone out and dragged them in, forcibly in some cases. These people we're calling our budget barometers. Let's start in Nottingham with Nigel Jackson. You've been squeezed more than anybody else thus far by Gordon Brown for tax. How does that feel? Is it painful?
It's very painful, Adrian. What upsets me is that for every £1 that my business earns, I end up with 20 pence, effectively, having paid VAT, office expenses, business expenses, higher rate tax, and then having got the 20p in the pound, it's then more tax for everything that's bought.
Right, I mean, there'll be people looking at your income there, just counting the number of noughts on your salary. They'll say, well, you should pay more. We've got to take the money off the rich to pay for better public services. Do you get any sense of that?
Yes, for sure. You know, it's not a question of not wanting to pay the fair share of tax. What upsets me, though, is that the taxes, or many taxes, are just not proportionately fair for whatever they're relevant to.
OK, Nigel, thanks for that. Let's go to John Austin in Middlesbrough. John, basically, you need a job. That's your point, isn't it? No matter what the Chancellor's done for you over the last couple of years.
That's correct, yes.
Now you've travelled. You used to live in London. You're from Wales, but moved to London for work. Couldn't find work in London. Now you've moved to Middlesbrough.
Yeah, I moved up a couple of months ago, and although I've applied for a job up here, I didn't get that one either.
Yeah.
And really, it's just that getting the help to get us over, you know, as people are over 50 back into work. They're saying there's work out there for us. Well, you know, prove it and get us back into the job line, because I don't want to be sitting in the house all day. You know, I've even had to take out another course now to occupy myself.
I would suggest that Gordon Brown looked at somebody like you, he said the man wants work, he'd try and help you out. In what way do you feel he has helped you?
Well, I don't think he's helped me at all at the moment. I mean, with what little I do get on the unemployment, he's putting up the bus fares and everything else, and, you know, how am I supposed to, you know, get to these places to find work for a start? It's not easy when you've got to budget yourself to just your food and everything else.
I mean, the money they've taken off Nigel Jackson in Nottingham for tax, do you think that's being well spent on people like you, on helping you, I don't know, with transport and so on?
Well, not really, no, because they're saying they're going to help us with transport, but they don't seem to be doing much about it.
OK, we'll see what you make of it afterwards. Thanks for that, John. David Cathcart now in Manchester. Now, you lie awake at night worrying about the national insurance changes, don't you, David? So just tell us about that. You as an employer, that's hit you quite strongly.
Yeah, it has, Adrian. I think the effect of national insurance this year is going to hit us very, very hard. We've had to make a few redundancies this year due to the effects of last year's budget, and I'm hoping it's going to get a little bit better this year.
So you're paying more national insurance. Are you getting your money's worth back at the other end, so to speak, on the way the money it takes off you is being spent?
I don't think we are, actually. I mean, if we could have some sort of guarantee that this money was going to where the Chancellor said it was going to go, then I think I'd sleep a bit easier at night, really. But
yeah. But you've got kids at private school, haven't you? You've got private health insurance.
It's a sore subject, really, because I feel as though I get no value whatsoever from the national insurance that I actually pay.
Because your kids are at private school and you've got private pension and you've got private health insurance?
Absolutely, yes.
OK, we'll see how you get on this year. Josh Jeffrey in Brighton. Interestingly, Josh, you were a student till this time last year. Now you're in your first job. So you're paying your first decent wage of tax. How does it feel? Do you think the right amount is being taken out of your wage packet?
Yeah, I think it's probably a fair amount. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's too unreasonable.
It's interesting that you're on a relatively low income. You've just started work. Yet, if you'd been in this job last year, you would have lost £120 already. So you're already being squeezed, although you don't know it because you've got nothing to prepare it to. You haven't got a previous year's salary. Where would you like that money spent that has been taken off you?
Well, I suppose I'd obviously like it to go into public services. But in my local area, for example, I'd like the government to start maybe sort of building things like have more houses for more council houses and things like that. I'd certainly want it to go back into public sector. Although I know he is putting money back into public sector, I'd like to see a bit more evidence of it, I think.
Okay. Josh, we'll talk later. Thanks for that. With me in the studio, we have a tax expert, John Whiting, a savings and investments expert, Christine Ross, and a benefits and pension specialist, our correspondent, Simon Gompert. Simon, we'll start with you. Let's focus on where the Chancellor is starting from now, what he's been doing up till now in your field. So on benefits and pensions, where are we?
Well, it's all happening now because his new tax credits are starting from this month, from this week, in fact. So let's go through them quickly. First of all, there's the child tax credit, and for middle-income families, this is worth about £10 a week. If you pass the means test he's included in that, you can get more per child. There's then the working tax credit, which the Chancellor would say is part of his strategy to make work pay. So there's as much as £58 a week for couples there if they again pass a means test. An interesting thing about this is that it also applies to couples that don't have children and to singles as well. So there's a lot there for people on a low income. And the other thing to think about, hasn't started yet, but it's starting in October, is the pension credit, a guaranteed £102 a week for pensioners and more if you've saved for yourself.
OK, John Whiting writes with a pencil, is an accountant, one of the few accountants that actually speaks in English. Talk to us about the tax implications of what we've had so far from the Chancellor.
What we've had so far, over the years he's been Chancellor, the tax burden has just inched up a little. Companies, employers have probably actually seen the worst hit. For individuals, it's been a little redistributive. Those less well off have done better than those better off. What's really in the bag and what's biting now is, of course, this national insurance increase, this 1% extra on the rates. That's bringing about 8 billion, 4 billion from the employees self-employed. And then there's personal allowances. They've been frozen for ordinary people like you and me. The elderly are doing better. They at least see their allowances going up.
And Christine Ross, from a savings and investments point of view, I was with you at the budget last year and you were disappointed in your own sweet way because there wasn't much in there to help investors in your view.
There hasn't been much from Gordon Brown for savers in the last few years. He doesn't seem to want to use tax breaks to encourage people to save. He seems to have the idea that that really just helps the wealthier individuals shift money around. I'm hoping he's going to perhaps change his mind, but broadly speaking, there hasn't been a lot. Have to wait and see.
We'll hear from Mel later in Swansea, who from Swansea is in our Cardiff studio. She was putting it to me yesterday that you get, she's got relatively low income but wants to save, but you're taxed on what income you've got, you're then taxed on whatever interest you make on the savings, and then on dividends and stuff you're taxed too.
That's right, there's very little incentive, and also because people just really feel that in the end the state's going to provide one way or the other. Is there a real incentive for them to save or to enjoy themselves more today? OK,
we'll drink more deeply from the fonts of your wisdoms a little bit later. David.
We're going to the House of Commons in a moment for Prime Minister's questions, which starts at midday. Andrew, listening to those voices, are they the ones that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are really thinking about rather than what's going on in Baghdad?
In the end, they know that these are the kind of decisions which make people vote for one party or another. It's how people feel, it's the economy is stupid, it's all of that. There will be an enormous impact from Iraq and what's going on there at the moment in the House of Commons, on the media, in politics generally at the moment. But that fades very, very fast. And Tony Blair's chances of another really good election victory depend far more on these relatively humdrum, small-scale looking decisions than they do actually on the momentous events abroad. That's always been the case. All prime ministers get lured into the glamour and excitement and the sort of thwack of foreign affairs sooner or later, and it's always a danger for them because they come back and they face voters who are much more interested in taxation and is the NHS actually getting better.
Is there a danger of Blair failing to learn that lesson?
There absolutely is a danger. Foreign affairs are much more interesting for a Prime Minister. You have more freedom of control, your press is often more flattering, and improvements, change, seems less difficult when you're on the foreign stage than it does when you're grinding through Whitehall departments at home.
Evan, what degree of bamboozle is there going to be in this? Because chancellors... somebody wrote a very good thing about budgets. The Chancellor understands them. Nobody else does. It takes a day or two to work it out. He knows what he's doing.
You have to remember that the budget speech is not a comprehensive speech of record, if you like. He doesn't have to say everything. He doesn't have to... he can be a little bit selective about what he highlights and what he says. We have to watch out for re-announcements. It's not just re-announcements, it's the kinds of things that we've heard last year maybe going into consultation. In the pre-budget report we would have had the update on the consultation. Today we'll get the actual measure, and so for the third time we'll hear about something, I don't know whether it's bingo tax or something like that was in consultation a year ago. I'm quite sure the Chancellor's going to always want to go on and re-announce those things. So it's always a matter of watching out for those. I think another thing, David, to watch out for is whether there are stealth taxes in this budget. Now, I'm rather suspecting that there won't be. Of course, in the earlier days of Gordon Brown, there were quite a lot of little pots he could put his hand into and take some money out without people really noticing very much. Gordon Brown has now done that so much that there actually aren't many of these pots left with great amounts of money in.
And anyway, we've learned to spot them.
And we've learned to spot them. And the fact that he had to put up national insurance a year ago, I think, tells you that there's no easy money to be raised.
Well, there's just a few moments to go before the Prime Minister's on his feet. So let's go over to the House of Commons now. I think the Prime Minister's arrived there, and join Mike Fairbairn. What kind of reception did he get, Mike?
Well, it was very muted, actually, David. They don't tend to shout and cheer and wave their order papers as much as they used to, but he slipped in a couple of minutes ago, almost unnoticed, in the middle of the last answer from a minister from the Northern Ireland office who've got questions on at the moment. Mr. Blair just sitting there looking at his folder, flipping through the questions he'll have to answer in a moment. As I said, we're just ending Northern Ireland questions, which of course have been given added significance today after yesterday's summit at Hillsborough with Tony Blair and President Bush. MPs have welcomed the engagement of Mr. Bush in the peace process. So we move on now, and the first question to Mr. Blair.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, sir, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in the House, I will have further such meetings later today. I'm sure the whole House would once more like to express its deep condolences to the families of the servicemen and others who have lost their lives during the last week of the conflict in Iraq. Again, we salute their courage and give our heartfelt gratitude for their sacrifice.
May I associate myself with the words of the Prime Minister about those who've fallen in battle in Iraq. But may I ask the Prime Minister, is he aware of another battle, the battle to save Britain's pharmacies, in the light of the Office of Fair Trading report? May I ask the Prime Minister for an assurance that his government will not introduce any policies that will fundamentally threaten the future of Britain's pharmacy network and the remarkable job they do for people throughout the length and breadth of Britain?
Well, of course it is vitally important that we maintain the pharmacy network. It's also important, however, that we pay due attention to reports that are given to us about the virtues of competition, and I'm sure that we will strike the right balance between those two objectives.
Kevin Hughes.
Speaker, as the coalition forces move deeper into the Iraqi cities, they are uncovering and being guided towards and shown torture chambers, rape rooms and other horrifying evidence of the brutalities committed by Saddam and his henchmen. A sickening picture of the killing inflicted on innocent people. Will he ensure that this evil is eradicated from Iraq by ordering the hunting down of these people butchers?
He speaks from experience. His son is serving in the Gulf.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I think we would also want to express our deep regret at any loss of innocent civilian life during the course of this conflict. It is, I'm afraid, the unfortunate consequence of war, but my honourable friend is absolutely right to draw attention to the plight of people in Iraq under Saddam, not just to the torture chambers and the routine barbarity, but to literally the thousands of people killed and brutalized every year by Saddam's regime, by the roughly, according to the recent estimates from some of the non-governmental organizations, some 1 million children suffering from malnutrition as a result of the way that the country is run. And I hope when we assess the humanitarian picture, for all the difficulties that there are there at the moment, naturally, I hope people do understand that for the vast majority of people in Iraq, the absolute humanitarian priority was to be rid of the regime of Saddam Hussein.
Ian Duncan Smith.
In the last 3 weeks, British and American troops have defeated Iraqi forces, taken Basra, and now it seems the regime is fast losing its grip on Baghdad. Even as we speak, Iraqi people are celebrating in the streets. This has been one of the most brilliantly executed campaigns of recent history. May I join the Prime Minister in paying a heartfelt tribute to the professionalism and bravery of British troops in Iraq and remember those who have given their lives for this country. I congratulate the Prime Minister, and I'd like to take this opportunity to do so, for the role that he has played, standing together with our American allies, liberating the Iraqi people and ousting this evil dictator. However, the Prime Minister will recall that at the end of the last Gulf War, Iraqi generals signed a document of surrender on behalf of the Iraqi regime. And the current regime is in complete collapse, it appears, and we do all want to prevent further unnecessary loss of life. Given that, from whom does he believe, or does his advisers believe, that the coalition can now accept an unconditional surrender?
Well, first of all, in respect of our troops and what they've done in the past few weeks, I wish to record once again our pride in their enormous courage, their professionalism, their skill, and also to pay tribute, in fact, to the coalition troops as a whole, because the American troops in that remarkable advance on Baghdad also showed their professionalism and skill. And indeed, I would pay tribute, because it's not always possible to do this, to the Australian and other special forces and other support staff that have played their part too. In relation to whom we would take a surrender from, it is extremely difficult as we speak to know what is left of the governing higher ranks of Saddam's regime. And I think the best way of answering that would be that we must be clear that whoever we accept, a final declaration that so far as Saddam's regime is concerned, the war is over. Whoever it is has that proper authority. Now, I cannot at the moment make a judgment as to who that may be, but one thing that we must...
Well, there's a lot of laughter in the chamber. Somebody shouted out Galloway, meaning George Galloway, maverick Labour MP who seems to be quite fond of Saddam Hussein. Even the Prime Minister's laughing at that.
Right. I'm going to resist all temptation at this point, so we will have to wait and see.
Ian Duncan-Smith. Well, Mr. Speaker, on Monday, some reports seem to indicate the Defence Secretary had appeared to make light of some of the looting in Basra. However, this morning, as looting spread to Baghdad, the aid agencies said that they would not deliver aid to Basra until the security was ensured. And I also understand that there are now reports that members of the regime are using the disorder to cover themselves whilst they remove evidence from government buildings. Will he confirm that British troops are now policing the streets in Basra and arresting looters? And given that British commanders have recently said that they are thinly stretched, does he believe that policing in Iraq will require reinforcements either from the UK or perhaps some other countries?
The answer to the latter point is that it may do. I mean, we just, again, can't be sure at the moment. But in respect of Basra, our armed forces are doing their very best in what is a difficult situation. I think there is bound to be a certain amount of disorder, probably a certain amount of lawlessness in the aftermath of the collapse of Saddam's regime in places like Basra. But they are doing their level best to restore order. There is an inhibition on them, however. This is, I think in the military jargon, this would be called a semi-permissive environment. In other words, it is not secure for our troops yet fully. And obviously our military commanders want to make sure that in whatever troops they employ, as it were, almost on policing duties, they don't put their lives at risk. Subject to that, they do believe the situation is more under control today than it was yesterday. They're also meeting with local officials to try and make sure that within the local community there is order restored. And just before I came to the House, I was being briefed on the fact that some of the local leaders are now coming forward and offering their assistance in making sure this policing happens, and indeed some of those people that looted and took property yesterday are returning it.
Turning to the weapons of mass destruction, there's been potential finds of illegal missiles, chemicals and suspect warheads. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that there should be an independent verification by UN weapons inspectors? And what steps are being taken to ensure that this should happen?
We are in discussion with the United Nations about this. I mean, plainly, it would be a good idea from every perspective to make sure there is some sort of objective verification of any potential weapons of mass destruction that are seized. And I mean, as we speak, there is obviously an investigation going into certain of those weapons that were taken a few days ago. Tests are being carried out there, but it's important, I think, for the international community as a whole, that as we establish control, and indeed as people working on these programs are free to come forward and speak to us, that we make sure there is a legitimacy given to this so that there can be some objective assessment of the truth of the situation. And certainly, so far as we're concerned, perhaps this allows me to say once again, we have no doubt at all that these weapons of mass destruction exist. And I do say to people, sometimes people say, well, why haven't you been finding them as you've gone through the country? The truth is, there has been a 6-month campaign of concealment. It is not surprising we have not found these. We need the evidence of the experts and scientists, but we're convinced that we will get it.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Over the past few weeks, the war of words between Syria and the United States has escalated. Does the Prime Minister share US concerns about Syria, and what does he believe Syria must do now to ease those concerns?
There are two issues, the immediate of which was any suggestion that Syria was supplying arms or equipment to the Iraqi regime in respect of the war. They have assured us that they are not, but we have made it very clear, most recently in my conversation with President Bashar, that that would be unacceptable. Secondly, I think there is a longer-term issue, which is the need to make sure, especially if we are moving forward with some process of peace in the Middle East, that all support from countries like Syria for terrorist organizations and for those who would actually destroy any prospect of peace in the Middle East ceases and ceases entirely.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, everybody in this House would agree that in the reconstruction of Iraq, we accept that it must be run by the Iraqis. However, there has to be an interim authority which is to be run by General Garner. Will the Prime Minister confirm whether this interim authority will have the specific endorsement of the United Nations?
Well, there are actually two processes. One is the office that will be run by General Garner and others, including British people as well, which is in the immediate post-conflict situation. But then as soon as possible, the interim authority should be an Iraqi interim authority. And we should develop that as soon as we can. For that reason, we are suggesting a series of ways that we make sure that we find out who are the proper representative people from the different parts of the country, from the different groupings, and we bring them together. Now, in that, obviously the coalition forces will have a role, the United Nations should have a role. And I see no reason why, if we approach it sensibly, given that Kofi Annan has now appointed a special advisor, I see no reason why we can't do this in a collaborative way. And if we do it in that way, the interim authority is likely to have the legitimacy that it needs, and it's important that it has that legitimacy and is seen to have that legitimacy in the outside world. And if the United Nations has, as we said yesterday, a vital role in that process, I think that will make it all the more easy to do.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
The Prime Minister's remarks, then, he will have been aware of President Chirac's unhelpful remarks saying almost exactly the opposite yesterday. And it means, really, in a sense, that we may not be able to achieve such a resolution. Yet the Prime Minister's International Development Secretary has said that without a UN resolution, coalition troops will represent, and I quote, an occupying army with no legal right to reconstruct Iraq. Does the Prime Minister share her view?
In respect of the remarks of President Chirac, I think it's important to look both at those remarks, but also at the remarks of the German Chancellor and indeed Kofi Annan's spokesman, the UN General Secretary, who I think gave a broad welcome for what was said yesterday. There are obviously going to be negotiations and discussions about this. It really depends in the end as to whether people want to reach an agreement or not. I think if they do want to reach an agreement, it's perfectly easy to do so. Yesterday, President Bush could not have been clearer on this, that the UN should have a vital role, not just in humanitarian aid, but also in relation to the reconstruction of the country. And I believe that we can wait and see how this situation develops. We're in constant discussion with these countries concerned ourselves. Indeed, I'm due to speak to President Chirac later today about this. And with goodwill, I think we will reach a way through.
Kevin McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the reasons that we went into Iraq was to establish the rule of law. Can my right honourable friend give an undertaking that none of the prisoners taken by Her Majesty's forces will be transferred out of their custody until their position has been properly established by independent tribunals, and they will not be sent to Guantanamo Bay without there being a proper reason for it?
Well, I can certainly assure my honourable friend that in respect of any of the prisoners of war that we have, we will make sure that they are treated fully in accordance with international law. And there are very, very strict rules laid down in respect of this, and we shall abide by them.
Charles Kennedy.
Mr. Speaker, in paying tribute to the courage and the professionalism of our armed forces, would the Prime Minister agree? Would the Prime Minister agree that we owe it to them?
Allow the honourable gentleman to be heard. Order.
Would the Prime Minister agree that we owe it obviously to them as much as we do to the innocent Iraqi civilians to win the peace, having successfully prosecuted the war? And would he agree, therefore, that it is going to be vital that relationships with Russia and with our European allies are properly re-established so that we can get the funding into Iraq, which will be central to that reconstruction programme?
It is obviously vital that we do everything we can to make sure that Iraq gets the future that we've set out for it. And I hope other countries, Russia and others, will cooperate with us in that regard. In the end, it is going to be important, however, the critical thing will be to make sure both that we deal with the immediate humanitarian situation, but then that we make sure that the Iraqi Interim Authority is run by Iraqis who are genuinely representative of the entire country. Now, we've set out a process yesterday that allows us to get there, and I hope that Russia and other countries cooperate with us in it.
Charles Kennedy.
Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister was having his meeting with the American President, was the President able to indicate, in terms of the Middle East roadmap, whether the American administration would accept the Israeli government's interpretation that this is all subject to possible amendment at a future stage?
Well, the roadmap is a series not just of steps and of process, but a series of very, very clear undertakings that have got to be entered into by both sides. And the roadmap has been drawn up by the US, the EU, Russia and the UN. And I don't doubt there will be all sorts of representations made about it. But the fact is, the roadmap is there as a way through, and therefore, in its essential particulars, we have to abide by it and make sure that it's implemented. And that's why he will have heard the United States President say once again that we are committed not just to publishing the roadmap, but to implementing it. Now, of course, people will make their representations, they're bound to do so, but implementing the roadmap means exactly what it says.
George Fuchs.
Does my right honourable friend agree that the reconstruction of Iraq, particularly from the decades of neglect by Saddam Hussein, needs not just the involvement of the UN and all its agencies, but the World Bank, the IMF, the G8 countries, and that our main concern should be that once the media spotlight is off Iraq, we maintain our commitment to the restoration of prosperity and democracy?
I agree entirely with that. I mean, I should point out to the House that this conflict is not, however, over yet. And I think there are still some very difficult things to do. And as we speak, there is still intense resistance, not broad spread amongst the Iraqi people, but certainly still amongst those parts of Saddam's regime that want to cling on to power. So it's not over yet, but I entirely agree with my honourable friend. It is essential that we make sure that we commit to the reconstruction of Iraq. And Iraq, it is fair to point out, unlike Afghanistan, where we have had to deal with a country that has very, very few immediate resources, Iraq is potentially a wealthy country. It is the tragedy of Iraq that its wealth has not been used for the Iraqi people. And when we read, as appears to be right, that Saddam Hussein's wealth himself is around about $3 billion, whilst his people live in poverty, 60% of them dependent on food aid, we can see just how much there is to be done. But with the natural wealth there is in Iraq, that is work that can indeed be done.
Don Foster.
Notwithstanding the tremendous success of our troops, there have sadly been a large number of civilian casualties. The hospitals in Baghdad are crying out for urgent assistance. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that the coalition forces will do all they possibly can to get that assistance there as quickly as possible?
Of course we will do that, and again, as we speak, there are teams working alongside the American troops in order to do that. I should point out two particular problems we have had in this situation. One is that parts of Saddam's regime, as they have moved out of areas, have actually cut the power, and that has harmed our ability to provide humanitarian assistance and to provide power particularly in hospitals and other necessary areas. And secondly, it cannot be pointed out too often. We make every effort to avoid civilian casualties, but there is a problem because of the way Saddam has actually based the headquarters of some of his Special Republican Guard and some of his local security services in the most densely populated residential areas, and therefore it makes it all the more difficult for us to act in a way that preserves as much civilian life as we possibly can. That said, I think there has probably been more care taken on the targeting in relation to this military conflict than in any in recent times.
Una King.
Is the Prime Minister aware of the reported deaths of almost 1,000 civilians in one day last week? Those deaths were not televised. They took place in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in a conflict that has claimed almost 4 million lives, making it the deadliest war since World War II. Would the Prime Minister use his influence to use the upcoming G8 meeting to increase the numbers of UN observers and peacekeepers? Would he ensure us that just because those deaths were not televised, the victims will not be forgotten?
It's an entirely justified point that my honourable friend makes, and I can assure her we are working closely with the United Nations and other troop-contributing countries to ensure the deployment of what was supposed to be almost 9,000 UN peacekeepers that was mandated by the UN last December. We're trying to insert them into the situation there. And once again, we exhort all parties to abide by the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1468, which condemns violations of human rights and international humanitarian law and calls on all parties to cease their hostilities immediately. And I can assure her, even with the public attention naturally focused on Iraq, we continue to be as active as we possibly can on this issue.
Bob Spink.
Is the Prime Minister pleased or saddened by reports that the tests for us joining the euro have not been met?
That was Bob Spink, a Conservative.
You will have to wait for the assessment until it is made.
Dr. Stephen Ladyman. My right honourable friend will be aware that the Thanet Council, working closely with the government, has worked wonders in regenerating the district, creating business parks and even a new university campus. But we still have great difficulties getting developers to prefer to work on brownfield sites and the renovation of existing houses rather than developing greenfield sites. Will my right honourable friend ensure that we focus our intention on making sure that arrangements are in place that will encourage people to develop our old Victorian towns?
Well, I entirely agree with him on the issue that he raises. I mean, it is extremely important that we make every effort to try and develop brownfield sites and make sure also that we take back into use empty homes that have been empty homes on a long-term basis. And without in any way previewing what the Chancellor is going to say later, I hope he stays around for the budget statement.
Sir Patrick Cormack.
In considering precisely what role the United Nations will have in post-war Iraq, would the Prime Minister reflect on the record of the United Kingdom and the United States in building durable democracies in Germany and Japan, and doesn't he think that compares rather favourably with the UN record in Somalia?
I think the reality is that there are examples of the UN working well, there are examples of the UN working less well. What is clear is that the UN does not want the sole responsibility for doing this. In any event, it is simply not practical. What is important, however, is that the UN is involved in this and has, as we said yesterday, a vital role in it. Now, we will be the occupying forces. I think if we set up the Iraqi Interim Authority in the right way, working with the UN, we will get a representative body that can then take charge of their own country. And the key thing is to make sure, whether by joint commissions, as we did in Afghanistan or elsewhere, that we get a broadly representative government. And as I said a moment or two ago, I believe this is a situation where if people want to find a proper solution, they can. I think the fact that Kofi Annan has appointed a special advisor is important. It allows us to work with them, and with goodwill, we will get this job done in the best way for the Iraqi people, because this shouldn't be a diplomatic wrangle. This should actually be about what is best for them for the future.
Malcolm Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the USA, Prominent proponents of war with Iraq are now demanding regime change in Iran and Syria. Does my right honourable friend recognise the consternation that is caused by the conjunction of that with comments about those countries made by Rumsfeld, Rice and even Powell, and the aggressive strategic theories of the Bush administration? Will the Prime Minister impress on our US allies that a precedent has not been set for further preemptive wars without international consensus in the Middle East or elsewhere?
What is actually being said by the US administration and ourselves is that in respect of any actions that Syria and Iran are taking at the moment, those should be actions that do not interfere with the proper progress of the military conflict and also building Iraq properly for the future afterwards. And that's why we have said both to Syria and Iran it's important that they do not provide military help to people who are engaged in action against coalition forces. Now, I think that is a perfectly reasonable position, and I would not, if I can say this respectfully to my honourable friend, read any more into the position than that.
John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the growing importance of humanitarian aid in the war against Iraq, and given the fact that we send nearly £1 billion to the EU overseas aid package, money which is largely spent by Brussels for political purposes, as evidenced by the fact that the top 10 recipients are all countries bordering the EU, will the Prime Minister now override his Secretary of State for International Development and divert this money to Iraq, which is where it is far more desperately needed?
I think the debate over humanitarian aid in the EU is long-standing, and actually my right honourable friend is one of many secretaries of state in different parts of the European Union who have been asking for changes to that. I would have to say to him, however, two other things. The first is that the aid that we give to those surrounding European countries is still important because they're countries that are undergoing a process of reconstruction. And secondly, I've no doubt at all that the European Union, we'll be able to discuss this further next week, will want to give full humanitarian assistance to Iraq because the EU naturally has a role to play in this and can play that role very well.
Meg Munn.
Given the vital importance of the small business sector to the well-being of our economy, and given that many small businesses tell me that their staff are their greatest asset, will the Prime Minister explain the benefits to the small business sector of the new rights for working people?
We have, well, it is an important issue because we have changed the rules so that more small employers are able to claim back 100% of maternity, paternity and adoption payments. And so we are improving the situation for them, but also by increasing significantly maternity pay and the length of time people can take an unpaid leave, and also the measures we're taking for flexible working. I think this will give more and more people the opportunity to balance work and family life, and it is also good for employers because, as my honourable friend rightly says, for employers their staff is their main asset.
Reverend Martin Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware there's a great deal of discussion going on about a new police college in Northern Ireland. Does he share my concern that strand one of the agreement has been breached by the offer of the Republic's government to fund some 30 million if it's built in Ebrington in Londonderry, which would only support one political party, and at the same time, on the budget day, would we be right in assuming that perhaps the 30 pieces of silver is now $30 million?
Well, I think, if you'll forgive me, I won't simply give him an answer off the top of my head, but I'm afraid I'll have to correspond with him about that.
Linda Gilroy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister share the pleasure which the pupils, teachers, governors and parents must feel about the publication of the international study yesterday, which shows that English primary school pupils are amongst the best readers in the world? And will he go on working with our right honourable friend, the Chancellor, to ensure that the strong and stable economy which underpins the investment which helps to achieve that success continues?
We certainly will, and it was for England to be third behind, I think, Sweden and the Netherlands, out of 35 countries, ahead of France, Germany, the United States, many others in the world, is a tremendous tribute to what has happened in our primary schools over the past few years. And it has happened because of reform through the National Literacy and Numeracy Strategy, and it has happened through investment in the largest ever increase in education funding this country has seen. Which is why it is very important to continue that investment and not cut it by 20%.
Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister aware of the desperate state of farming in this country, borne out by the fact of the latest news that Brandon's turkey factory has gone into receivership yesterday? Will he ensure that the CAP reform does not work entirely to the disadvantage of the British farmers to please the French and the German farmers?
Of course we will, but we also recognise that for the farming industry they're undergoing a huge period of structural change which they have been undertaking for several years, and the best way of doing that is through the Curry Commission that we established some time ago. And I'm sorry for her constituents whose jobs will be lost as a result of the changes that have been announced, but I can assure you we will continue to try and get the very best deal out of the Agriculture Council that we can.
Order. So there we are, we've come to the end of Prime Minister's question time, and the Speaker, I should say, Michael Martin, is making way for the Deputy Speaker, Sir Alan Hazelhurst, who traditionally presides over the budget statement.
Order. Order. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer...
This, of course, is the first budget that's being held before lunch, or I should say probably instead of lunch for a great many MPs, because they'll all be
available
in here to listen to the Chancellor. The House of Commons hours have changed since the last budget. And here is Gordon Brown.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is half a century since a budget has been presented with Britain engaged in large-scale military conflict. On April the 10th, 1951, the then Chancellor told the House of Commons that heavy as the burdens may seem at times, they were small set against the cause which is great, and the courage of our armed forces which is even greater. And even as we look forward to the end of the conflict in Iraq, my first budget decision is to ensure proper provision for our military, for our domestic security, and for international development and reconstruction. I can confirm that I've set aside £3 billion in a special reserve available to the Ministry of Defence, so that our troops continue to be properly equipped and given the resources that they deserve and have a right to expect. And I believe the whole House will wish to join me in expressing our gratitude and support to our armed forces for the zeal, bravery and resilience with which they carry out their duties and for their outstanding achievements. And I believe we owe a debt of gratitude to the strong leadership in a difficult time of our Prime Minister. At home, our responsibility is to safeguard our communities from terrorist threats, and here our resolve again is absolute. It is therefore right also to set aside in this budget an extra £330 million for additional domestic counter-terrorism measures. The Home Secretary will therefore take forward measures to improve detection work at our ports and enhance our response to a range of terrorist threats. The House of Commons will again be united in taking every step to preserve and protect the security of the people of the United Kingdom. Looking forward, there are three long-term challenges to which the international community must rise and which will require additional financial support: reconstruction in Iraq, a lasting Middle East peace settlement, and a new and urgent effort going beyond debt relief to combat the injustice and instability caused by world poverty. To contribute to the United Nations appeal and to carry out humanitarian work in Iraq, for which we owe a special thanks to the Red Cross and international aid organisations, the Government will contribute £240 million, including for the United Nations £100 million. And to back up the UN and the work of reconstruction and development, I will today set aside an additional $100 million. And just as it is right for Britain and America to lead action in Iraq, it is now right for Britain and America to lead action against the hopelessness of poverty in the poorest countries. This Saturday in Washington at the G7 and then IMF and World Bank meetings, Britain will, with all-party support for which I am grateful, table our plan for a $50 billion a year international finance facility to fund primary education for the 115 million children around the world without it, and to fund healthcare and life-saving drugs to tackle AIDS, malaria and TB at prices that poor countries can afford. Yeah. And I believe that the whole House will also support our proposal to overhaul the European Union aid budget and redirect EU aid so that instead of 60% bypassing the poorest countries, more European aid will be targeted at reducing world poverty by half by 2015. Yeah. It is now time for the world's richest countries, in word and in deed, to fulfil their obligations to the world's poorest. Yeah. I will report today that Britain, even in difficult world conditions, is able to meet our military and security costs abroad and at home, to meet the costs of building peace, and to do so while maintaining in full our record investment in schools, hospitals, transport and policing, and providing new help in this budget today also for British business, industry and commerce. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, as the major economies look forward to the opportunity, if the right decisions are taken, for a global upturn, Britain starts from the foundation of low inflation, the lowest inflation for 30 years, the lowest interest rates for 40 years, the highest levels of employment in our history, and I can report today that Britain has now experienced the longest period of sustained economic growth and the longest period of growth in living standards in half a century. Yeah. And I can tell the House that unlike America, Japan and Germany, the British economy has grown uninterrupted, free of recession, in every single quarter over the past 6 years. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, having reformed the economy since 1997, the budget marks the next stage. It is to achieve in our time a more flexible, more enterprising, full employment Britain, a Britain of economic strength and social justice. Because our economy will have to be better equipped for the global upturn, this budget's detailed economic reforms will seek for each region and nation greater flexibility in capital markets, in product markets and thus prices for goods and services, greater flexibility in our housing and planning, in mortgages and in labour markets. Britain is closer than we have been for 3 decades to full employment. And so today, with social security, housing benefit and employment reforms I will announce to encourage greater flexibility and fairness, this budget will advance our goal of full employment in every region and nation of the United Kingdom. And because it's a Britain of economic strength and social justice we seek, we now plan, paid for by the National Insurance tax rise, by 2008, 80,000 more nurses than 1997 and 25,000 more doctors. And this budget will further reform and secure public services and the NHS we believe in, free at the point of need. And as the first government for 3 decades with clear goals to reduce poverty amongst children and the elderly, the House will want to know that in this budget I will introduce a new guarantee with immediate effect for every newborn child in this country and a new guarantee with immediate effect for every pensioner in this country. Now let me first give the detail of the economic outlook. I can report that inflation has averaged 2.3% in the last year, is expected to be 2.75% in the 4th quarter of this year, and will be 2.5% next year for every one of the following years. Before Bank of England independence, the pre-1997 inflation target was 2.5% or less. But market expectations of UK inflation, 5, 10 and 20 years ahead, were around 4.5%, almost double the target. Today, in 2003, because of the success of the monetary regime we introduced in 1997, and I pay tribute to the retiring Governor of the Bank of England, Sir Edward George, and the Monetary Policy Committee, we have a symmetric inflation target of 2.5%, and on a 5, 10 and 20-year perspective, the markets expect inflation to be exactly that, 2.5%. And it's because since 1997, the monetary policy and the Bank of England have established credibility that in a particularly uncertain period for the global economy, monetary policy has been able, supported by fiscal policy, to steer a course between deflation and inflation, cautious about domestic risks, including affordable pay settlements and the housing market, and vigilant to global risks in equities, in trade and in investment. And it's for these reasons that while under the old regime 30-year British interest rates were higher than those of Germany and America, in 1997 nearly 8% compared with 7% in the USA and 6.5% in Germany, our hard-won stability now means that these long-term British interest rates at just 4.7% are today below those of Germany, below those of the euro area, below those of America. So British monetary and fiscal policy has been able to respond to the world downturn, keep the British economy stable and growing, and it is that steady economic leadership, vigilant to risk, resolute in our commitment to stability, that is essential for a post-conflict world economy that, while still fragile, has the potential for renewed growth. I'm required to set the inflation target in each budget. In 1997, I spoke of the case over time for moving to a new domestic measure of inflation. The advantages of the current indicator of inflation, RPIX, is that it is known, well understood, and has served us well. The advantages, however, of the internationally recognised index of consumer prices, HICP, is that it is in line with best international practice and is used by every other G7 nation but Japan and by our neighbours in Europe. So there is a case in principle for adopting for Britain this index of consumer prices, and the Treasury will continue to examine the detailed implications of such a change. Today, I am reaffirming our symmetrical inflation target based on the current RPIX measure. Our target for the financial year will be 2.5%. I can report now that since the last budget, there are 253,000 more jobs in the UK. In the last quarter of 2002 alone, 150,000 new jobs were created. There are now 1.5 million more people in work than in 1997. Unemployment in Germany, France and Italy is around 9%. In the euro area as a whole, it is 9%. In Britain, it is 5%. British unemployment today is lower than in the euro area, in Japan and America together for the first time for nearly 50 years. Over the same period, that a total of 3 million jobs were lost in America, employment has risen in Britain by 500,000, and the number of unemployed claiming benefit has fallen below 1 million for the first time since 1974. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of all the major global economies, Britain is now alone in combating inflation and combining that with the lowest unemployment for a generation. Now, in recent months, the oil price has fluctuated between $23 and $33 per barrel. Among the continuing risks is, as everybody knows, the volatility of global equity markets, which have come down, though there have been sharp movements in recent days. Even in the world downturn of the early 1990s, world trade continued to grow at nearly 5% a year. But world trade grew by just 0.1% in 2001, and while it recovered to 4% growth in the first half of 2002, it slowed again to just 1.7% in the second half of the year. And so I understand the concerns and the difficulties of manufacturers and exporters and all those trading across the world. And that is why, in the interests of Britain, Europe and the poorest countries, the world trade talks, now stalled on agriculture, pharmaceuticals and services, should be moved forward with urgency. We now know that in 2001 and 2002, economic growth in Germany has averaged 0.4%, in Japan 0.4%, the euro area 1.1%, America, taking the 2 years together, just 1.4%. And here in Britain, with growth in 2001 of 2.1%, and then in 2002, 1.8%, we have averaged 2%. Higher, therefore, than America, much higher than Japan, much higher than the euro area. And looking forward, the largest repercussions for the British economy arise from the further fall in growth prospects for the euro area to around 1% in 2003. German growth, expected at the time of the pre-budget report to be 1.3% in 2003, is now expected to be just 0.4%. Here in Britain, I now expect growth this year will be 2 to 2.5%, double the euro area double Japan, and about the same level as America. So just as the record shows that in 2001 and 2002, Britain with North America outperformed the rest of the G7 industrialised countries and were the fastest growing economies, so again with all the risks, we are expected with North America to be the fastest growing G7 economies in 2003. Mr. Speaker, in the two previous world downturns, in both the early 80s and the early 90s, the British economy was in recession and output contracted for 5 whole quarters in a row. But this time in a world downturn, it has grown every single quarter. Employment, which fell by 1.3 million in the early 80s and 1.6 million in the early 90s downturn, this time has not fallen but risen by 500,000. Inflation, which rose to 20% in the 80s downturn, 10% in the 90s, has this time averaged just 2.3%. Interest rates, which peaked at 16% in the 80s downturn, at 15% in the 90s, are today 3.75%. And mortgage rates, which rose to 15% in both the early 80s and the early 90s, are under 5% today. So unlike the early 80s and 90s downturns, when others were in charge, and when Britain was first into the downturn and suffered most and longest, I can report to the House that this time, on growth, employment, inflation, interest rates, and also for debt and deficits, where I remind the House in 1993 borrowing peaked at 8%, in today's money £83 billion of borrowing in just 1 year. This time, Britain, even amidst global uncertainty, is not only doing better than in the past, but also doing better when we make the comparison with these other countries. Now, fixed investment, which has fallen just as business investment has fallen around the world, and is in the euro area still falling, is expected to grow in Britain this year by 4.25% to 4.75%, with business investment moving up from the second half, and then 4.75% to 5.25% next year. Manufacturing output, which has fallen in every major industrialised country in the last year, with difficulties for the whole sector, is expected to grow in Britain by 0.25% to 0.75% this year, and then 2.25% to 2.75% next year. With the housing market and consumer spending now moderating, we expect domestic demand to grow by 3 to 3.5% this year and in 2004. Risks remain and are real, but with inflation and interest rates low, with fiscal policy in Britain supporting monetary policy, and with the world, particularly America, poised to make what we believe will be a steady recovery over the course of this year and next, we expect British growth overall to rise in both 2004 and 2005 by 3 to 3.5% as the economy returns to trend. Private consumption as a whole is expected to grow by 2.75% to 3% this year and 2.5% to 2.75% next year, building on 6 years from 1997 in which the typical British household has seen each year an average 3.5% real terms rise in their income. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, throughout the post-war period, Britain has faced a productivity gap with our competitors, and in particular now a substantial gap with the United States of America. The latest productivity figures from the Independent Office for National Statistics, and now updated from the census of 2001, are published in full in today's budget report. The most recent data shows that the productivity gap per head with Germany has narrowed to just 4%. With France, that gap is 16%, but has fallen significantly, and the productivity gap with Japan has been eliminated, with Britain now 7% higher. But despite the progress made, Britain and the rest of Europe still have a productivity gap between 20 and 30% with the United States. And so, with rates of corporation tax, small business tax and capital gains tax already amongst the lowest of the major economies, our budget reforms learn from American innovation, competition and enterprise, and that is why we will introduce these new flexibilities into our economy, reforms that will be important for our future prospects in Europe. 2/3 of the productivity gap with America is due to the poorer quantity and quality of innovation. So it's a priority to raise research and development from today's 1.9% of GDP towards America's 2.8%. Having launched the successful R&D tax credits last year, we are following representations from the CBI and others, announcing improvements today in the credit scope and value, and that we will consult with business to improve the definition of qualifying research to ensure it keeps pace with technological developments. Because 2/3 of that R&D credit is paid to manufacturing, this is of special help to manufacturers in our regions. To back up our extra £1.25 billion investment in science itself, not least the 40 million over 2 years, we are investing as a world leader in stem cell research. I have asked the Inland Revenue to report on further help for already tax-exempt research and technology organisations so that Britain can, with these changes, lead the world in new discoveries and then new industries and jobs. 1/3 of overall productivity gains comes from new entrants to markets, start-up and then growing businesses whose dynamism transforms commerce, challenges existing businesses to do better, and when we have flexibility, increases our competitiveness. For small firms that are looking for capital of between £250,000 and £1 million, there is evidence of an equity gap that prevents them from realising their full growth potential. Small business investment companies, backed by government incentives, now make almost 60% of all venture capital investments in American small business, and they help finance the early growth of now large companies such as Intel, Apple and FedEx. To match this success, I am publishing proposals for the creation of British small business investment companies, and these will be private sector vehicles to inject new capital into small and medium-sized firms. Because of the importance I attach to creating the best environment for investment, even when under pressure to meet the costs of war and reconstruction, I will today back up the cut to 9p in small business tax by funding 3 tax reliefs and incentives that will help companies in industrial and in rural areas to make the most of the opportunities of the upturn. By raising the qualifying threshold for small and medium-sized businesses to the maximum possible under EU law, that is £20 million, a total of 3.7 million businesses will be eligible for 40% investment allowances. A total of more than 3 million businesses will now also qualify for 100% allowances for investment in IT, which I am extending for a further year to April 2004. Sectors that include 400,000 firms will now be eligible to borrow from the Reformed Small Firms Loan Guarantee Scheme, including catering, retail and vehicle repairs. Each of our constituencies has thousands of small business, self-employed and sole traders. Indeed, there is an average of 5,000 per constituency. From tomorrow, firms with turnovers of £56,000 or less will not have to register for VAT, and that is the most generous VAT threshold in Europe. From tomorrow, we will also abolish automatic fines for late payment of VAT for 200,000 more small businesses. In 2000, we released 150,000 companies with turnovers under £1 million from burdensome audit requirements, and subject to a consultative review this summer, we propose to release many thousands more. 10 years ago, it took 28 regulations and certificates to form a business in Britain. Even today in mainland Europe, it takes around 4 weeks and an average of £600. Today, in a Britain more flexible, just 1 week and only £20. And to cut costs further and enhance that flexibility, from tomorrow, 650,000 firms will no longer have to account for every VAT transaction and can now opt for automatic flat-rate VAT payments, cutting out unnecessary paperwork. Next month, the Home Secretary will designate for reform or abolition 40 additional regulations and procedures, making a total of over 500 regulations and procedures, 500 introduced by previous governments that are now identified for reform and or abolition. Where we find local enforcement of regulations uneven and unpredictable, we will consider using our reserve power to introduce statutory codes of enforcement practice. We have invited the CBI, Institute of Directors and others to second their experts to join us to remove unnecessary regulations, starting with construction, transport and environmental services. To meet concerns raised by business, I can announce that the Information Commissioner will produce revised and simplified guidance on the Data Protection Act. The National Statistician will review exempting more firms from statistical requirements, and new procedures will make it easier and simpler from this year for small firms to compete for government contracts. And because flexibility at a UK level should be matched by flexibility in Europe, we are proposing that Europe's competition authorities proactively investigate barriers to competition, starting with financial services, and we have now agreed to submit to the EU Jobs Review our employment strategy that could help Europe's 15 million unemployed. Britain does lead in job creation, in tax credits that make work pay, and this week, learning from Europe, we have introduced new maternity rights and the first ever paternity pay. And in striking the balance between dynamism and social standards, our position is that no change to European regulations like the Working Time Directive should risk British job creation. To break down the trade barriers between Europe and the USA and to build a stronger transatlantic economic partnership, we will propose to the Commission and to the US government liberalisation in services and the faster removal of tariffs between our countries. I have examined rates of corporation tax, small business corporation tax and capital gains tax, and I propose to freeze them. On air passenger duty, I propose to freeze rates. On insurance premium tax, I propose to freeze rates. On the climate change levy, I propose to freeze rates. I propose from Monday the annual inflation rise of 1 pence on a pint of beer, 4 pence on a bottle of wine. I will freeze duties on cider and sparkling wine. Because past governments set higher taxes on the alcohol content of spirits than on beer and wine, I will, for the 6th budget in a row, freeze all spirits duties. That is the longest freeze in duty for 50 years, and it will benefit whisky producers in all parts of the United Kingdom. I turn now to bingo. I will abolish the bingo tax on August the 4th, just as I've abolished direct taxes on the pools and on betting on horse racing. The tax on bingo player stakes and the tax on bingo prizes will be replaced in the same way as tax on betting in the pools. So I can tell the House it will be a gross tax on company profits for bingo at 1 in 5, 15%. I have also to make a decision on fuel duties. Owing to the recent high and volatile level of oil prices as a result of military conflict in Iraq, I have decided to defer the 1.28% a litre annual revalorisation of fuel duties until 6 months from now, the 1st of October, and I will legislate to this effect. And if the current international uncertainties and volatility remain, I will not proceed with the change at all. I will also freeze vehicle excise duty rates for lorries and for motorcycles and raise excise duty rates from May the 1st on cars and vans only by the normal inflation rise of £5. But to encourage the development of the least polluting cars, I will offer a new rate £110 lower than the standard rate for a licence. Bioethanol fuel reduces air pollution and greenhouse gases emissions substantially. To encourage its development, I can announce that when the industry is ready on 1st January 2005, we will reduce bioethanol duty by 20 pence per litre. Enhanced capital allowances designed to encourage energy-saving technologies are set out in detail by the Inland Revenue today. In January this year, we abolished royalty payments from the North Sea. I can now announce that from 1st January next year, and for all contracts completed from today, we will abolish petroleum revenue tax on new tariffing business in the North Sea. My decision on cigarettes is for public health reasons to go ahead with a rise, the annual inflation rise of 8 pence per packet of 20. Last year, I raised the exemption for inheritance tax to £250,000. I propose now to raise the exemption to £255,000. 95% of estates will pay no tax. All income tax rates and tax allowances will remain as set out in last year's budget and in the pre-budget report. The Inland Revenue's discussion documents on residence and domicile is published today. I want to say something about the housing market. I can now report that since 1997, an additional 1.1 million British families have become homeowners for the first time. Home ownership, benefiting from the lowest mortgages for 40 years, is rising in all parts of the United Kingdom to 70% of all households in the UK. It's the highest level in our history, and it is higher now than in America and Europe. But while most mortgages elsewhere are fixed rate, most UK mortgages, 64% of new mortgages, are at short-term variable rates, with most of the rates fixed for just 1 to 5 years. And with housing demand at historically high levels, housing supply has remained low. And this has contributed not just to over 30 years a greater growth in house prices, 3 times that of Europe, but to the volatility and inflexibility of the housing market, an issue on which we will publish a background study as part of the Treasury's 5-test assessment on the euro. Most stop-go problems that Britain has suffered in the last 50 years have been led or influenced by the more highly cyclical and often more volatile nature of our housing market. Housing finance needs to become more certain and planning more flexible. I have asked David Miles, Professor of Finance at Imperial College, to examine the case for and how Britain can develop a market for long-term fixed-rate mortgages, something that is important to the UK in or out of the euro, and certainly more important in a single currency area. The Deputy Prime Minister and I are asking Kate Barker, formerly of the CBI, to examine and report on how we can reduce barriers to increase housing supply, and backing up his decision to double public investment in new homes and in the renovation of housing estates, the Deputy Prime Minister is announcing today he will intervene where planning authorities fail to prepare proper plans or deliver an adequate supply of new housing, if necessary call in proposed major housing developments, and consider the case for binding local plans to increase certainty and ensure the stability of the housing market. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will freeze stamp duty on homes. I will freeze stamp duty on homes and business property purchases. As a result of tax avoidance, only half of all commercial property transactions that are worth £10 billion a year are paying the stamp duty that is owed. As I announced last budget, the Finance Bill will introduce new tax avoidance powers to close these loopholes. And because tax avoidance and distortions could take the form of leasing, the Finance Bill will make provision to restructure the stamp duty currently paid on the rental value of all new leases at a proposed rate of 1%, 4 times lower than the usual stamp duty rate on which we consulted. To provide time for further consultation with business and commerce on how to promote a more level playing field between leases and transfers, I propose to trigger this reform only on December the 1st. I will do so and only do so if, after consultation with the industry, there is no effective alternative for tackling avoidance. If I have to trigger the change, I will increase the exemption from stamp duty for commercial property from £60,000 to £150,000, and I will exempt leases up to £150,000. So in any event, there will be no duty on 60% of commercial rental contracts. We are also reforming the tax treatment of home purchases funded by alternative mortgage products, including Islamic mortgages, where in the past home buyers have been charged stamp duty twice. Anti-avoidance measures on VAT fraud, share-based remuneration, loan relationships and derivative contracts are set out in detail by the Inland Revenue today. I now turn to policies that will benefit specifically the economies of our regions and the nations of the United Kingdom. Past civil service relocation reviews have included the Fleming Review and more recently the Hardman Review, which led to over 10,000 civil service jobs transferred out of London. The Deputy Prime Minister and I propose that we now examine not only the civil service but non-departmental bodies and other public services with the aim of achieving best value for money. Successful relocation out of London by private sector companies suggests public sector jobs transferred out of London to the regions and nations could exceed 20,000 jobs to the benefit of the whole country. So today we're asking departments to submit updated workforce development plans and asking Sir Michael Lyons of Birmingham University to advise with a view to decisions on relocation by the next spending review. The more that each of the UK's regions, and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, enter into global competition, the more we must encourage and help them harness their distinctive strengths, overcome economic weaknesses, and with a modern, locally led regional policy, rise to the challenge of making skills, innovation and enterprise world-class. To meet the needs of manufacturers investing in our regions, who now receive 2/3 of both the R&D tax credit and permanent capital allowances, regional venture capital funds are now investing £270 million in high-growth businesses. But while business research and development in the South East is £450 per head, it is just £50 per head in the North East. and small business creation rates in the poorest areas are unacceptably low, at 1/6 of the most prosperous. So the Secretary for Industry is asking Sir Tom McKillop of AstraZeneca to advise on the extension of regional science and industry councils. We will devolve more responsibility for small business services and training to the regions. In partnership with the banks, we are offering a new online service to give small business advice on training. And today we are adding to the incentives for small business creation in the 2,000 places in the UK with the most deprivation that we have designated enterprise areas. To speed up development, there will be fast-track planning approval. To cut the cost of property purchases, stamp duty is abolished. To cut the cost of initial investment, access to the Phoenix Fund with the prospect of enhanced capital allowances. To cut the cost of risk capital, the community investment tax relief, and to encourage entrepreneurship, enterprise advisors for local schools. And in the past, the more new business local authorities have encouraged, the more rateable income has flowed to the Treasury with no benefit to them. So we will legislate that from April 2005, local authorities and central government will share the receipts that result from new business creation to the benefit of local citizens. The modern route, indeed I believe the only route to full employment for all regions and nations, is to combine flexibility with fairness. 6 years of reform have moved Britain to a new system where instead of just signing on for benefit at a local social security office, the first requirement is signing up at a job centre for active job search, for help with training, and 2 million people have benefited from the New Deal. Some parts of our country, however, still have twice the unemployment of others, and too often national rules in employment policy do not encourage local initiative and innovation. So it's time to give local job centres discretionary powers so that in ways that are targeted, distinctive and flexible for their own areas, they can fill local vacancies, help the long-term unemployed respond to local employment and skill needs in industries from tourism and the rural economy to IT and manufacturing, and develop their local plan for their area for full employment. So in place of the Whitehall-controlled ring fencing, the Secretary for Work is announcing local discretion to award grants for training, travel to interviews, direct cash support to bridge the transition to work. There will be new powers to provide intensive job preparation courses and early entry into the New Deal, and drawing on a new ethnic minorities fund, job centre staff will be able to tackle the particular barriers facing those who too often miss out on jobs. In return for that local discretion, a new performance regime will accord higher rewards to top managers with provision to change the management of the worst performing. Too often, unemployed men and women say that when they lose housing benefit, it's not worthwhile working. So the Secretary for Work is also announcing today that from next April, men and women taking up jobs will no longer be required to submit a new claim for housing benefit. They will simply inform local benefit offices. Until benefits are recalculated, they will continue to be paid the out-of-work rate. And in addition to requiring the long-term unemployed in 40 areas of the UK to take jobs on offer, for those unemployed for 13 weeks, we now propose widening the area of job search to within 1.5 hours of home, a new 6-week period of weekly rather than fortnightly signing on, for all unemployed an increase in the number of job applications and other requirements in return for benefit, for the partners of benefit claimants, work-focused interviews help to support the search for a job. Some of the hardest to help into work are young offenders, 70% of whom re-offend. So the Home Secretary and the Minister for Work are now seeing how we can apply nationwide, under the leadership of John Parker of Transco, the successful Reading Training for Work programme, and we will offer young offenders training and work while in prison with on good behaviour a job when released, a programme with a 78% rate of success so far. Tough on the causes of crime and tough on crime. 1 million disabled men 1 million disabled men and women desperately want jobs. And so as a first step for men and women on incapacity benefit wishing to work, there'll be an extra £19 a week as we raise the guaranteed minimum income to £194. Welfare to work is only the first stage. Just as in the past we've helped people move from unemployment to employment, the next challenge, the new agenda, is to help move people from low-skilled work to higher-skilled work. And because nobody wishes Britain to compete on the basis of low pay, but on the basis of high skills. The right to education to 16 must be complemented by a right to lifelong learning. It is a classic case of social justice building economic strength. And while it's in the national economic interest that every adult has the basic NVQ2 qualification, 8 million adults in Britain today do not have them. And the radical way forward we propose that is in return for employers giving staff time off for basic training, government will contribute towards training and wage costs, and employees themselves can then move up the skills ladder. So the Education Secretary is doubling the already successful employer training pilots, naming a further 6 areas of Britain today at a total overall cost of £170 million. We will also review for 16 to 17-year-olds training pay and employment needs, including the case for 16 and 17-year-olds having a minimum wage. And today the Modern Apprenticeship Task Force meets for the first time as apprenticeships once withering away rise by 2006 to 320,000. Moving beyond the old voluntarism of the past, a national effort for skills. Everyone, government, employers, employee, trades unions, has a responsibility and a part to play, and we will extend the Trades Union Learning Fund by £3 million extra in 2005. Now, expanding the skills we need requires not only new investment and training, but a modern approach to the economic and social benefits of legal immigration. It has been so important to the past success of the US economy and now to ours. UK work permits have risen from 47,000 to 140,000, and so the Home Secretary will now expand the highly skilled migrant programme, introduce measures for younger applicants and partners. He will encourage foreign nationals graduating in math, science and engineering in the UK to seek a career in the UK, and he will expand the work permit scheme for industries like construction, which face skill shortages, while meeting the challenge of combating illegal immigration, supporting legal immigration, which contributes to economic strength and social justice. There are 200,000 more lone parents in work than in 1997. Lone parent employment has risen to 54% as we advance to our 2010 goal of 70% of lone parents in work. And following the report submitted yesterday by the BT Chief Executive, Ben Vervain, and published yesterday, employers starting in London with BT and initially in Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds and Newcastle will provide for lone parents work preparation courses, offer flexible terms backed up by help with childcare, and for lone parents who voluntarily attend regular work-focused interviews and undertake job search, we will offer an extra £20 a week to cover job search costs, rising to and topping up wages for a year, £40 extra a week when they move into work. While the minimum wage today is £147 for a 35-hour week, the tax credits raise the minimum family income for a lone parent with 2 children to £276 even after tax, almost twice as much as the minimum wage. And tax credits are the modern route to eradicating poverty by making work pay. For lone parents who want work but want to work part-time, we will now do more. With a housing benefit disregard for lone parents on a typical rent of £50 a week, part-time work will pay £213 a week, more than £10 an hour, making them far better off working part-time than not working at all. Last month, we showed our confidence in the future by announcing a rise in the minimum wage for this year and for next. And with the new tax credit system in place, a couple where both are earning with 2 children now have their tax bill cancelled out until their income, including child benefit, is just under £20,000 a year. And the same couple with 3 children will have their tax bill effectively cut to zero until their total income, including child benefit, is £22,500. And that same couple with help for typical childcare costs would have their tax cancelled out until they earn just under £30,000. Our reforms in the tax system are guaranteeing that work pays, and whichever part of the country you live in, and even if you change to a job which pays less, it means for lower earners that for every £10 lost in pay, up to £7 is made up through the new system. And with this national framework of fairness set in place, I can tell the House that the British economy is now better placed to recognise local and regional conditions in pay, such as the extra costs for retention and recruitment that arise in London and the South East, especially for the low-paid. So in future, we plan regional price indices showing differences in regional inflation rates, Remits for pay review bodies and for public sector workers, including the civil service, will include a stronger local and regional dimension. And with the new housing benefit Pathfinder scheme offering a flat rate in the private rented sector based on location and household circumstances, it makes sense not only to roll out this pilot nationwide, but to develop a similar flat rate housing system in the social sector. And in these ways, we will make housing benefit work more effectively, more sensitively and more fairly in each area of the country, removing the barriers to work. So the flexibility that I propose in employment, in pay, the measures for liberalisation of capital, labour and product markets, flexibility is important for competitiveness in the global economy and our engagement in Europe, is not bought at the cost of fairness for families, but is underwritten by policies for full employment, for tackling poverty through tax credits, and for more investment in public services. And these are measures that combine the flexibility that is too often undervalued in Europe, that is essential for enterprise, with the fairness too often undervalued in the USA, that is essential for social cohesion. And it makes Britain a leader for those who see enterprise and fairness advancing together. Now, it is because from 1997 that we took decisions to freeze spending, then to cut debt, and to use the Spectrum auction to repay even more debt. And it is because we have cut unemployment and we have cut debt interest payments that we have been able to raise public expenditure on health, education and our anti-poverty programmes. We have been able to meet the additional commitments on employment, industry and support for families I'm announcing today. And yet, at every stage of the economic cycle, and including in the cautious case, we have been able to meet all our fiscal rules. So let me provide the detailed figures. Figures for our current budget for last year, 2002-03, and for the 5 years to 2007-08, are -12, -8, -1, +2, +6 and +9. So we meet our golden rule over the cycle. We will not only achieve a balance, that is the golden rule over the cycle. We will not only achieve a balance, but with an estimated surplus at £32 billion, showing that it is right and prudent to borrow at this, the right time in the economic cycle. And adjusting for the cycle, we meet the golden rule this year, and we meet it every year to 2006. And our second rule, the sustainable investment rule, is that debt should be kept below 40% of national income. Debt this year is actually rising to 42% in France, 46% in the USA. Wrong country, Mr. Deputy Speaker. 49% in Germany, 55% in the euro area, 76% in Japan. But I can tell the House that in Britain, debt this year and in future years will be at 32.2%, 32.7, 33.2, 33.5 and 33.8, comfortably meeting our sustainable investment rule and doing so over the cycle and in every year. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are within the Maastricht criteria on deficits and debt, and as planned, I will present the government statement on the assessment of the euro by the first week of June. The House will have before it all of our background studies, 18 background studies, as well as our assessment of the 5 economic tests. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is because of the tough decisions that have led to the low debt that I have just described that I can, in the financial year which has just ended, make the full £3 billion allocation to the costs of military action in Iraq, contribute to humanitarian aid, improve national security at home, and with borrowing at £24 billion, 2.3% of GDP, still have a debt ratio this year as low as 30.9%. It is the lowest debt ratio of all major competitors, and we have not been and we will not be diverted from increasing investment on our health and public services at a faster rate than in any post-war period. Indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, compared with the deficit of 8% of GDP 10 years ago and an average of 6% over the early 90s, the figures for net borrowing for this year and future years are just 2.5%, 2.1, 1.9, 1.7 and 1.6%. Net borrowing for this year's and future years is therefore 27 billion, 24, 23, 22 and 22. And cyclically adjusted net borrowing, which is forecast this year at 2.5% in America, higher at 2.6% in France, 2.3% in Germany, 7% in Japan, is in Britain just 1.7% last year and this year, and in future years 1.5, 1.5, 1.7, 1.7 and 1.6%. With these figures showing that we meet both fiscal rules comfortably, I can therefore confirm to the House all of the decisions of our spending review. By 2006, over £1 billion a year more on housing, £5 billion a year more on transport, £15 billion a year more for education, £40 billion more a year by 2008 for health. In total, by 2006, £61 billion more a year for public services, and at the same time I can build in extra caution for future years by prudently setting aside new resources in the reserve margin for annually managed expenditure, showing that Britain can combine economic stability and rising employment with also faster rising investment in hospitals and schools than in all other major countries. Britain showing that economic strength and social justice can advance together. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to make announcements as we plan the coming spending review about the next steps forward we propose to take. Both economic strength and social justice are advanced when parents can balance work and family life and are able to make real and effective choices. So we have asked the spending review to examine the future of childcare and family-friendly policies, and I propose a dialogue with family and parent groups and voluntary associations. For the first time from this month, 5 million families with incomes below £58,000 a year receive the new child tax credit, most receiving £26.45 for the first child, rising to £54 a week for the poorest. This is the best and fairest support for our nation's children in our nation's history, and together with record investment on our schools, the best investment in our nation's future. We are on track to meet our 2004 target for a 25% reduction in child poverty. And for the next budget and the next spending review, I've asked for a report on both the public service and welfare reforms we need to reach our goal of a 50% cut in child poverty by 2010 on the road to abolishing child poverty in a generation. In preparing the coming spending review, we also propose that work be taken forward with Britain's charitable, voluntary and community organisations so that they can play a fuller part in renewing the social fabric of our local communities. The review will also encompass two long-neglected challenges, helping children at risk, led by the Chief Secretary, and also tackling domestic violence, on which the Home Secretary will issue a consultation document shortly. The pre-budget report announced our support in principle for the creation of a gap year volunteer corps, supporting financially low-income school leavers who give a year of their time to community service. And I can announce that so strong is the interest from the voluntary sector that the Home Secretary is announcing that the first pilot for this new volunteer corps will start next month. To back up free entry to the national museums, to the main national museums and galleries, which has raised admissions by 70%, with 5 million more visitors, I now propose to review the incentives, reliefs and exemptions available to help national and regional museums and galleries make acquisition of works of art and culture which should not be lost to the nation, but instead should be accessible to the people of Britain. The Secretary of State for Pensions will report on the consultation on the pensions review and our proposed tax reforms shortly. The next spending review will also seek to maximise regional and local discretion in service delivery, matching national standards with local performance standards, reduced ring fencing, greater transparency, more timely performance data, overall greater freedoms and flexibilities for local authorities and other education, health and social services providers. The modernisation, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of the welfare state is not just about improving income and services, but ensuring that all have a stake in the wealth of the nation. A child trust fund, established for each child at birth, endowed during their childhood years, available at age 18, to which Britain as a nation contributes, expresses our shared belief in our country, that in our country every child should have the best possible start in life. So I can tell the House that for every child born from today, we will establish in their name a child trust fund. 700 700,000 children are born every year, and we will fund from this year and every year in future for each newborn child an additional endowment of at least £250, £500 for the poorest one-third of children, a reform which is progressive and universal, benefiting every child and with more to those who need help most. And we will report shortly on the proposal that during primary and secondary school years, each child receive additional payments into the Child Trust Fund. Parents and grandparents will also be able to contribute to the fund. The Child Trust Fund symbolises the difference between those who believe in modernising the welfare state and those who wish it to wither away. At age 18, on the basis of historic rates of return, the Child Trust Fund will accumulate assets that will enable all young people to have more of the choices that were once available only to some. This shows what we mean by putting wealth, power and opportunity in the hands of the many and not the few. So that every child in the same class at school will in future have a trust fund, I will align the payments to school years and I will backdate these initial endowments to September last year, so every child born since September 2002 will have their own child trust fund. Our country faces a great challenge. It is to overcome inequalities of income and wealth, and it is to build a Britain that is not just a property-owning democracy, but a wealth-owning and asset democracy open to all. And today's announcement is the foundation on which the government will build in future budgets and spending reviews. And none of this would be possible if we listened to representations to cut public spending by 20%. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is no section of our society who have contributed more to our National Health Service and who now depend on it more than Britain's elderly. We have always believed in a National Health Service free at the point of need. It's a commitment to which this government is, while in power, we will hold steadfast. But there is an unfairness which undermines that commitment, and which has unfortunately existed since 1948, when the NHS was first created. Thousands of pensioners in hospital are effectively charged a payment, with from 6 weeks cash deducted from their weekly pension to pay for meals and accommodation. It's a hotel charge imposed on one of the most vulnerable groups in our society. For everyone else in our country, other than those on pensions and benefits, hospital care is entirely free of charge. And therefore it is wrong that the elderly have saved all their working lives for their retirement through national insurance contributions should now suffer the reduction of their pension entitlement to pay for hospital care. So for pensioners, even if they stay in hospital for up to a whole year, I am today announcing we will abolish this charge. That charge will be abolished with immediate effect for pensioners going into hospital from today. And to those opposite who have advocated vouchers, fees, health charges for medical service or basic accommodation, this is the government's answer. We have not only rejected these charges, but are abolishing hospital accommodation charges, not just for pensioners, but for all who have charges imposed upon them through the social security system. I have one further announcement, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Starting next month, we'll be writing to every pensioner in Britain, telling them that from October all single pensioners with income below £139 a week and all pensioner couples with total income below £203 a week, that is, the millions of pensioners in our country who have modest savings and modest work pensions, that they stand to benefit from our new pension credit. In total, in the typical constituency of honourable members, 7,000 pensioners. Many couples will benefit by £20 a week, many single pensioners by up to £15 a week. The average additional payment will be £7 a week extra for single pensioners on the credit and £9 extra a week for couples on the credit. Mr. Deputy Speaker, at the age of 80, pensioners receive an addition of just 25 pence a week to cover the costs that getting older involves. At just 25 pence extra per week, it has rightly been criticised as inadequate. And I've had many representations from MPs on all sides of the House. To double or quadruple such a small allowance would not be a significant recognition of the needs of the very elderly over 80, or of the contribution that they have made to the life of our country and its success. The winter fuel payment, I regret, of £200 has not been supported by all parties in this House. But I hope, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there will now be all-party support for my proposal that for every household where a pensioner reaches the age of 80 or is over 80, we will add to the winter allowance of £200 an extra payment of £100, a total of £300 that will be paid each and every year to almost 2 million elderly men and women over 80. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a budget meeting our responsibilities at home and abroad, steadfast for stability, enterprise and full employment, tackling inequality, building an NHS free at the point of need, a Britain of economic strength and social justice. I commend this budget to the House.
Speaking for just under an hour, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, oodles of statistics, oodles of figures, oodles of percentages, not very many big changes. Let's just look at the main things, though, that have changed as a result of this. First of all, the duties. Duty on beer is going to go up by a penny a pint, wine by 4p, duty on spirits and cider is frozen, cigarettes go up in line with inflation. Because fuel prices are so high at the moment, he's deferring the rise of 1.3p a litre for 6 months until October. Then he turned to other spending. He's giving £240 million for Iraq, for humanitarian relief. Child trust funds are going to be established from today. That's a proposal that's been announced long before, of giving £250 up to £500 for the poorest children, and then a fund that can be invested until they're 18. And he's just announced at the very end £100 extra for people over 80 on their winter fuel payments, currently running at £200 a year. They're now going to get an extra £100. He talked about the economy, and he revised, as expected, his borrowing forecast to £27 billion, up a bit from what he'd said in November and up from what he'd said at the previous budget a year ago. His growth forecast for 2003, he pulled down to 2%, to 2.5%, and said that growth, a little bit more than was expected, was 1.8% last year. So those are the main measures. And in a moment, we'll hear from the Leader of the Opposition, Ian Duncan Smith. It's not the Shadow Chancellor who speaks after the budget, but the Leader of the Opposition. While we're just waiting for Mr. Hazelhurst to make some announcements, Andy Marr, what do you make of the gist of what he said?
Well, very few big announcements, really, compared with many budgets. Interesting, though, the politics right at the end there. Labour is terrified about mass abstention, a fall in the number of people voting at the next election. Who still votes? Pensioners still vote. Older voters turn out more often. And who has been particularly stung since Labour made that terrible mistake a few years ago about only uprating the pension by 75p? Pensioners. Gordon Brown is doing his level best to give Labour campaigners and activists in the months and years ahead something to say to the pensioners.
Evan, brief reaction?
It's a
No, I think we've got Ian Duncan Smith on his feet. No, we haven't. Go on, sorry.
Brown trick. He's admitted that things aren't as good as he thought this year, but he's put it all back later, so it all comes right on its own in the end. And that is just increasing the gamble, because it means if it goes wrong, then he has to come back and say, I got it wrong again, folks.
But that will be after a general election.
But that will be, that's
on the assumption he won that election.
Presumably thinks, why not? I mean, at this juncture, there's no harm in just doubling or rather than quitting. So it's a carrying on. So the borrowing, it's astonishing. The borrowing is a little worse than he thought it was going to be, but by 2006-07, it's more or less back where it was. He's back on target, meeting all his rules with a comfortable safety margin, and that I think is going to be a bit treated sceptically.
Ian Duncan Smith from the House of Commons.
On behalf of the whole House, I'd like to start by congratulating the Chancellor on his happy announcement this weekend, both he and his wife Sarah. I can assure him children are a great blessing, despite some of the trials. May I also start by welcoming some of the measures in his budget, particularly those matters regarding counter-terrorism, and his announcements to combat world poverty and poor education in deprived areas. We will certainly give that a welcome and support it as far as we possibly can. Mr. Deputy Speaker, over the last 6 years, we've come to learn that the Chancellor's budget speeches are characterised as much by what they conceal as by what they disclose. He's made it clear that he prefers to let the damaging detail, the fine print, leak out over the days and weeks that follow his budget. And today, nonetheless, despite all the Chancellor's bombast and bravado, we learnt a great deal. We learnt that the Chancellor has got his forecast wrong again. And we learned from the Red Book that his borrowing is up again. And we learned that taxes are up and they're going to stay up. And from this week, a typical family is another £568 a year worse off. And we also learnt that the Chancellor has no intention of being candid with this House or with the British people. Let me just have a look at some of the figures announced already in his Red Book. On page 235, we see, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the savings ratio this year is forecast to be even lower than it was last year. On page 241, we see that manufacturing output fell last year by 4%, and that the Chancellor's forecast for this year has been slashed as well. And on page 238, we see that business investment, forecast last April by him to grow this year by up to 6%, is now forecast to fall. We didn't hear any of these details from the Chancellor in his speech today. So this is the Chancellor, Mr. Deputy Speaker, who promised us prudence and has now given us higher borrowing and higher taxes at the same time. And his budget message to the British people is clear. Higher taxes, that's pain today. Higher borrowing, that's more pain tomorrow. And it's the Chancellor, Mr. Deputy Speaker, who has put up taxes on pay and jobs, on homes and homeowners, on mortgages and marriages, on petrols and pension. The government is taking an extra £5,500 per household per year. That's an extra £44 per week for every man, woman or child. And the Chancellor's excuse, his great excuse, is that it would make our public services world-class. Instead, we have 1 million people on hospital waiting lists. Crime is committed every 5 seconds, and thousands of children are leaving school without a single GCSE to their name. It's the same old story, Mr. Deputy Speaker. More tax, more spend, more waste. And that's the sum of the Chancellor's approach. And this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, from the government that promised, and I quote, "We have no plans to increase taxes at all. Our proposals do not involve raising taxes, and even we want people to pay lower taxes." Now, 53 tax rises later, this week, when people receive their pay packets, they will find that their take-home pay has fallen for the first time in 20 years. Now they know what the Chancellor really stands for. Promises, promises, promises. Every year he makes them, and every year he breaks them. And just as he's broken his promises, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to individuals, so he's broken his promises to business. In 1998, the Chancellor promised, and I quote, "major changes to help business." In 1999, he promised tax cuts for business. In 2000, he promised incentives for business. In 2001, he promised more good news for business. And today, he even promised new help for business. But today, we also see what his promises are worth. An £8 billion tax on jobs. That's the cost of national insurance that he has raised. And it's hitting business, and it's going to hit them very hard. So hard that the British Chamber of Commerce said that 1 in 5 firms are going to cut jobs directly as a result of his new tax. And in fact, the Chancellor has been so hard on business that since 1997, he has taken an extra £47 billion from them in tax. No wonder, Mr. Deputy Speaker, no wonder he didn't tell the House today about the real cost of his policies. He didn't say, for example, figures that are now clear, that insolvencies are at their worst level for a decade, or that analysts say that 70,000 firms will go bust over the next 3 years. And he didn't say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that manufacturing has lost 300 jobs every single day that Labour has been in power. And he didn't also say that manufacturing output and investment are now lower than when he delivered his first budget in 1997. And just as he's broken his promises to business, so he's broken his promises to hard-working families. Since 1997, council tax has gone up by 60%, adding more than £400 to a typical bill. And just look at the Red Book, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Council tax up by £8 billion since Labour came to power. Stamp duty increases have added £5,000 to the cost of purchasing an average home in the southeast. The abolition of mortgage tax relief has cost homeowners £200 a year. And the abolition of married couples' allowance has cost families £300 a year. And higher petrol taxes have cost the average motorist some £300 extra every single year. In short, this government's tax take has risen by over 50% since he became the Chancellor. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, all of those who have been hit by the Chancellor, of all of them, there is one group who will be hurt more than most. The savers today are the pensioners of tomorrow. Well, Mr. Speaker, they can laugh, but they're laughing at those who are saving for their futures because they're damaging them. And they laugh while the Chancellor is busy blighting their old age because he's damaging their future retirement. It's worth reminding all of them who want to laugh at this. In '97, he said that he was going to encourage personal savings. And in 2001, he said he was going to reward savers, pensioners, and hard-working families. And again today, he did all the same guff that he usually does about helping them. Promises, promises, promises. But under him, Mr. Deputy Speaker, savings have halved. When Labour took office in '97, the savings ratio was 10%. Today, it has fallen to 4.75%. It's all there in the Red Book. He's destroying savings. And his so-called reform, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to pensions. His pension tax, worth £5 billion a year, has hit every single future pensioner around. And he's also created a pensions crisis. Someone retiring today will now retire on half the income they would have retired on when they retired in 1997. Half the income. He should apologise to all those people he has damaged. And he hasn't just let down those who wish to retire in the future, because this is the man, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is the man who promised the end to the means test for pensioners. The end. But under him, the proportion of pensioners in their households subject to a means test has risen by 50%. Every single one will remember those words. And today, after 2 years and 3 consultations and re-announcements and re-announcements, the Chancellor decided to re-announce his Child Trust Fund again. More over-complicated proposals that will deal little and do little to help future long-term saving. And what they will do, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is extend means testing to even more people. But there's only one thing to say about this little scheme of the Chancellor's. One thing to say to him, if the Home Secretary would keep quiet for a second. One thing to say, all the money that he's offering to these children won't go towards paying their tuition fees or their top-up fees.
Well, the Home Secretary is certainly in a lively mood, sitting there right through the Chancellor's speech going, "Ruh, ruh, ruh," as bits and pieces were announced. Ian Duncan-Smith there. We don't take it all, but there is continuing coverage of the Commons on BBC Parliament if you want to go on watching the Leader of the Opposition. And for viewers with satellite and Freeview, if you have those, if you missed Gordon Brown's budget statement, you can press your red button now, and I'm told you can catch it again. And that will be followed by the opposition responses. And do go on sending us in your questions and comment. Just a reminder that our email address here in the Budget Studio is budget@bbc.co.uk. Any complaints, any praise, any questions, all welcome. OK, let's just look at the psychology of this budget. DeAnne, what is it that hour of speech has delivered?
Well, I think it's delivered a very hopeful message. I mean, it's clear that the Chancellor is placing his bets yet again on a revival of this economy next year and the year after that. Provided that all happens, then you hit the inflation target and the deficit begins to reduce after this year. But if it doesn't happen, of course, as it didn't this year, then what we see is a ballooning deficit in future years, not a shrinking one. Okay. And that's a real problem.
Evan, what do you read into it?
It's a budget very thin on measures because the Chancellor doesn't have much money to play with. I notice in the list of budget measures in the red book that we've just got, they've moved to double spacing to fill the 2 pages that they traditionally fill, which just tells you that there isn't a lot going around. But crucially, David, this is a budget which does have a very small giveaway. A £500 million net giveaway this year. Most of that's the the baby bond that he announced at the end of the speech. So far from raising taxes, as some of us have been saying he might need to do at this juncture, he's chosen to give a little bit away.
It's a bit rich saying that when everybody has just had a 1% tax hike on last Sunday.
For economists and
you may have
aficionados,
forgotten
that's
it, but
all
others
history.
haven't.
That was last year's budget. As of now, the new measures announced are actually a small net giveaway, which is this baby bond.
Andy, the euro and the debate on the euro and the tests weren't actually mentioned, but they were sort of weren't they?
They were the sort of ghost in the middle of the budget. It's a strangely themeless budget, this one, and we know that there have been discussions between Number 10 and the Treasury about whether they should put the whole euro issue and the tests into the budget. Decided very late on not to. I think you can tell Gordon Brown's view by the extremely Eurosceptic and dismissive description of the performance of the Eurozone. But I think there is a whiff of a deal here, because if you look at some of the detail of what he's proposing further down the road on housing and on inflation, I think he's promising Tony Blair, not now, but I'm going to put in place the measures which would allow us to go into the euro in a few years' time.
Okay. Now let's find out how Adrian's families are doing. Adrian Chiles.
We'll get to the family shortly, actually, Dave. We're just going to talk to some of our experts first. We'll talk with our tax expert, John Whiting. On income tax, you pointed out what you're calling stealth taxes here. How does freezing the income tax rates bands actually make a stealth tax?
Well, it drags more money into, in particular, the 40% tax band. Now, what he's done is, in fact, just raise it a tiny little bit by 600. Not as much as earnings, so it's continuing this trend of more and more people falling into the top rate income tax band.
Okay. On stamp duty, I heard him saying, well, he's freezing everything, he's not increasing anything, and you turned around to me and said, well, actually, the property companies are going to be worried about this. I didn't get that, not for the first time. What did you mean?
Well, stamp duty, he likes stamp duty. He gets a lot of money from it. He's frozen it for you and me buying our houses. Some people thought there was going to be a hike. He hasn't done that. What he's said, though, is he wants more out of the property business, in effect. People avoid it, perhaps by selling a company with a property at 0.5% stamp duty instead of the 4% tax. So he's trying to do some anti-avoidance to get some more money that way.
OK. The sin taxes?
Sin taxes, little increases, just a bit of inflationary on some of the booze, spirits, because that hasn't gone up, and the tobacco, nothing on petrol for the moment. Inheritance tax just gone up a little bit, the threshold. But one little thing, in amongst all these 62 press notices, he's going to review residence and domicile, the way tax applies to people who aren't really fully British citizens.
OK, so is this rock stars we're talking about? Or?
It could be rock stars, it could be Greek ship owners, it could be the horse industry. It's actually a very sensitive issue because although he may think there's a loophole, in fact it encourages people to come here and invest and spend in this country. So approach with care on this one.
On savings and investments, we've got Christine Ross here. Fixed-rate mortgages, you're going to encourage more of them. But if there's a demand for very long-term fixed-rate mortgages for 25 years or whatever, then the building societies or the lenders generally would have allowed for that and be offering them, surely.
It's not that straightforward. Obviously, fix a rate and provide fixed-rate money to borrowers for 25 years. One lender did it about 2 years ago. It sold out in days. Everybody wanted it. No matter the rate, people had certainty. They could buy that house. They knew they were going to be able to pay the mortgage. They did another tranche and that went too.
OK, but so the government's going to do something now to make it easier for the lenders to offer these products?
Certainly looks like it.
Baby bonds, children's
At
trust
last,
funds, whatever you want to call them.
As John said earlier, the longest pregnancy ever. It seems now that we're going to have, from children born now, we're going to have up to £500 at birth, but it's scaled down where the families earn more or have more money to £250. Parents and grandparents can contribute up to £1,000 a year to it. it, and the money's available at 18.
OK. Simon, benefits. What have we got there?
A few little changes that will make quite a lot of difference to some people. Job centres having a lot more power at the local level to help out with the search for jobs, say with travel expenses or any other expense of that sort, so more power to their elbow. Some housing benefit changes. For instance, when you start a job, you won't immediately have to make a new claim for housing benefit, and that'll ease the transition. You still get the benefit for some time. And lone parents who want to work part-time, they'll have special housing benefit arrangements as well to give them a little more. And a little more incapacity benefit too for people who want to work.
OK, and very briefly on pensions?
On pensions, an important change, first of all, for people getting winter fuel payment, which comes as part of your pension. If you're over 80, you'll get an extra £100. So that's quite substantial. And also the abolition of hospital charges for pensioners, a big one that we've seen a lot of complaints about. Pensioners having to pay to go into hospital. That's not going to happen anymore.
OK, we'll talk to you more shortly. Back to you, David.
Thanks, Adrian. Well, Jeff Randall is down in the city. You said earlier on that the love affair was over between the Chancellor and the city. What was the view to that budget?
Well, I think that noise you can hear behind me, David, is not the hum of computers. It's a sigh of relief. I think many in the city thought that the borrowing numbers would be much worse than they are. And frankly, they're really pleased by this. The Chancellor is frankly quite optimistic. Now, there is some scepticism in the city, of course, that these numbers will be right, that the Chancellor can meet these numbers. But before you came to me, I called up the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce and I said, what does business think? And he said, well, a cautious welcome, really. We like the tax credits for research and development. We like the help for small business. And all in all, British business too thought it could have been much worse.
It's interesting because some of the forecasters have rubbished his forecast before. Some of them still will rubbish this one, won't they?
Oh, they're bound to do that because you remember in the first 4 or 5 years of his reign, he was actually very good at forecasting. He was always slightly over-pessimistic and it gave him a bit of room to manoeuvre. Unfortunately, in the last 2 budgets, he's been overly optimistic and he's had to revise those forecasts. There will be scepticism here, but I can honestly say in this trading room behind me here at Barclays Capital, there is relief that the borrowing numbers aren't much worse.
Do they think that will start coming through in share prices in the FTSE index today?
Well, the stock market has taken it very calmly, David. The stock market was down about 35 or 40 before the Chancellor stood up, and it's still down about 35 or 40 today. All in all, no change.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Let's go to Sheffield now and go to Gripple Limited and rejoin Rob Pittam. Rob.
David, I can tell you that the wheels of industry kept on turning right throughout the Chancellor's budget. No one stopped for any production here, no one stopped production here to listen to what was being said, which was a shame in a way because a lot of the things the Chancellor mentioned were directed at companies like this and at places like this. A lot of talk about changing red tape, a lot of talk about redistributing jobs out to the regions. 2 of our guests here both run small businesses. Let's get their reaction first of all. Now, Jane, the last thing you said when we were with you before was you wanted to see red tape cut. Were you pleased with the talk about that?
I was pleased with, yes. I need to assimilate it more, but I certainly thought that the tax opportunities for small businesses was great, and also the support for enterprise, because our business also helps new businesses start, and he said quite a lot about what was around for that and how they wanted to push things out from London to the regions.
A lot of talk you'll say about moving jobs out to the region. Do you think that'll be good for Sheffield?
Yes, I do. We already have quite a good thing going, if you like, in South Yorkshire with the support with business links and so on. So we are already creating quite a lot of really sound businesses, and I think that we'll be able to do more of that. So I was really pleased with that. But I like the tone of it as well. I like the idea of enterprise and social justice. It really meets
so
where
positive from you. Niggett, you mentioned earlier on training when we were talking to you. Was there anything in the budget that caught your eye?
Well, definitely. He touched on training as in young people. And I do believe strongly that youth training scheme, if they go into their books prior when Labour was in before, all they have to do is open their books and make it happen, because youth training scheme, for businesses like us, we're large businesses. It's good for us. Why forget about us? We're there to help the smaller businesses become big. So why not help us help them? And they can come into our world and learn about training. Number 2, unemployment. Long-term unemployment. Very, very important. I live in the world, I live with people, and I can say the government should be giving them 3 days a week work, even on motorways. They'll get jobs. They'll go out and they'll get jobs if they have to go and work for government.
OK, Niggett, thanks very much. Let's get some more reactions, some more of our guests. We're actually in the heartland of Sheffield's manufacturing base here, and let's find out how this went down with some of the manufacturers. Chris is the MD here at Gripple. Now, Chris, you mentioned beforehand R&D and the Chancellor's extending the tax breaks on R&D. Is that good news?
Well, it is good news. We'll have to see the detail of it, obviously, to see where it extends to. We're also interested in the rise in the medium and small threshold to 20 million. That's a particular interest to us. But unfortunately, no mention of the euro again. Very disappointing.
So overall, disappointed or happy?
A little bit disappointing. Not enough for growth.
You're very keen on the euro, aren't you?
We are, yeah.
You felt what his comments were negative?
Just no mention of it. I mean, 85% of our business goes in export territories, so it's important to us.
Okay, Chris, now when I spoke to you last time, you said to me that manufacturing hadn't enjoyed a budget for 20 years. Did you enjoy this one?
No, not at all. And you're going to have to excuse my cynicism about the R&D tax credit. But if it's anything like the employee share ownership schemes, which were flouted, and then the inland revenue quickly dissipated our interest in the idea, we were never able to get it approved. I think the Treasury needs some joined-up thinking and some cooperation between themselves and the inland revenue, or this will be just as big a disappointment.
Okay, Chris, thanks very much. And John, you're from the Amicus Union. Now, you were talking about manufacturing help for that. Did you see any signs of it?
Not really. Saw a lot of help for small businesses and small enterprises, which is welcome, and like some of the help for training and putting people back to work with the tax credits, etc. Disappointed with his comments on the euro. I thought he was very negative. Also, the other big thing which he missed, which is in crisis, with the pensions crisis. Nothing on that. Bit of a mixed bag. Bit disappointed. Needs more for manufacturing. So we'll see.
And what about what he mentioned about jobs going out to the region? Surely that's going to help Sheffield, isn't it?
Yeah, I would hope so. That's very welcome. But of course, the jobs have got to be created, etc. Still need the incentives on the credits for the investment in the plant and machinery, which could have been higher, I feel, and that would have been vital, which had really been a big perk up for manufacturing, would have given the confidence back to all manufacturers, because the people in the big manufacturers in the offices in Tokyo and New York may have not liked a lot what they've heard today.
Okay, John, thanks very much. Well, I think it was a very mixed response there, and interesting reactions to no mention of the euro in the budget. Back to you, David.
No mention of the euro, though, as Andy Marr was saying, around the euro, he talked a lot about how Britain was going to do better than the eurozone, which suggested they weren't going to come out very favourably. In the first week of June, incidentally, he said that decision was made. That's just 8 weeks or so away. A reminder of what was in this budget: duty on beer to rise by a penny and wine by 4p. Those are in line with inflation. Spirits and cider, no change in the duty. Cigarettes go up in line with inflation. And the fuel duty, the rise that you normally get around now, is held back till October because fuel prices are so high. On the economy as a whole, he increased his borrowing up to 27 billion for this year. He forecast growth down by 0.5%, that's 500 billion or so, for 2003, but then saw it recovering, and he said that growth in 2002 was 1.8%. He announced extra spending for relief, humanitarian relief in Iraq, 240 million. Child trust funds were going to be established from today. They've long been waiting, as somebody was saying earlier on, the longest gestation in history. And £100 extra on winter fuel payments for people over 80, and also the abolition of accommodation charges in hospital for pensioners over 80 who have been charged from their benefits when they go into hospital. Well, now let's join Zainab Badawi. Zainab.
David, thank you. I've assembled a group of people here to talk about some of the key points that the Chancellor made in his speech. As far as the Iraq war is concerned, of course, Gordon Brown didn't say anything new. We knew that he was already giving £3 billion to the war effort. The last Chancellor who was, the last man rather, who was Chancellor when the last Gulf War began was in 1991, and that was Norman Lamont. Norman Lamont, wars are traditionally difficult times for Chancellors because you're just there to sign the cheques, essentially. But tell us about the longer-term pressures that a war can bring to the economy, the headaches it can bring a Chancellor.
Well, the immediate impact is obviously just on spending, but you don't know the cost of a war until the war is over, and it's many months later when the bills are added up. The war also has an impact on the economy and on confidence, lowers growth, and therefore affects your revenues. But I don't think the Chancellor can blame his problems in terms of borrowing, if they are problems, on the war, it stems from other things, essentially his forecasts and the slowdown in the economy.
But just sticking with the war, I mean, what are the ways that a Chancellor can raise money for something like the Iraq war?
Well, the obvious thing to do is to do what he did and just take it out of the reserve. That's what you have reserves for, to cope with unforeseen events, and the classic one is a war, and he's just taken it straight out of the contingency reserve, which was already in the provisions for public spending. So in one sense, it's not that difficult.
All right, and a lot of people are saying, well, once the war is over and if things go according to the military planners, the war may be over a lot sooner than many people expected. What happens then? Could the peace be more expensive?
Well, there obviously are items to do with the reconstruction of Iraq, but we don't know what part will be paid by other countries, what part will be borne by this country. There will be other bills coming in, but it will be a long time before we know what the cost of the war is. And I'm not sure that it will, I've seen estimates of 4 billion, but I'm not sure that it will exceed the 3 billion that he's taken out of the contingency reserve. I heard the other day, for example, very interestingly, that actually they've used less ammunition in this war than in the last Gulf War.
Briefly, Lord Lamont, I mean, however things go on the war and for the economy here, we can't really isolate ourselves from what's happening in the world economy. The US is a big driver. If things don't go so well there, well, then what can we do here?
Well, I think that's right. I think most people are expecting a bit of a bump up in the markets immediately the war is seen to be over. But of course you can get that and then get markets listlessly drifting down again, which is what a lot of people expect will happen. America looks quite overvalued. Things are slowing down a bit in America. I don't think everything will go away just in some post-war euphoria.
Lord Lamont, thank you. Rabbi Julia Neuberger, moving to health. Again, no announcements expected. We knew what was coming for health, but a lot of people are saying, well, OK, we appreciate there is more money going into the NHS, but what we want to know is it all going to be swallowed in higher salaries and bigger staffing levels?
Absolutely, and what are we going to see at the end of it? And it's a bit early to tell. I mean, what he's done, I think, very rightly, is emphasise that, you know, the NHS is going to be free at the point of use, or free at the point of need, as he constantly put it. What he said is, you know, this is the hugest investment. We're seeing 40 billion extra money over the 5-year period, and that is colossal. What it's a bit early to say is this going to make a huge difference to the outcomes in people's health? We will see more staff. We certainly are going to do that. What we need to know is when the government says we've hit those targets, we've got that amount of waiting times down, is that absolutely as everybody perceives it, or do we need more independence in the observance of whether those targets are being met? We would say at the King's Fund that the new Commission for Health Audit and Inspection needs to be at some considerable distance from government to give it that independence.
So throwing money at the NHS is one thing, but how that money is spent is another to ensure better delivery for the patients.
Absolutely.
Julia Neuberger, thank you. Pierre Williams, you represent the House Builders Federation. Now, the Chancellor talked about the need to increase housing stock for key public sector workers like people who work in the NHS. But the problem is, surely, can't build the houses quickly enough.
Well, that's right. It's not just for key workers. The root cause of the problem is a lack of building, a lack of supply that's been manifesting itself over the past few decades. We've reached the point where there are more households than dwellings. We've got a very poor older stock. And that's the root cause of house price inflation, an imbalance between supply and demand. And the reason that's come about is because local planning authorities have failed to deliver on sufficient homes. They've rejected new housing schemes following local opposition. And it's that imbalance which has increased prices. And the government's now aware that it has to increase supply to get some stability in the market and to further increase affordability. We need a more natural affordability so we can get that home-owning democracy which the government is talking
And Gordon
about.
Brown said he wanted to make sure that there were no planning barriers. Doesn't that mean a lot of local communities are going to say, oh, that means our objections to more houses being built in our backyard are going to be overturned?
Well, we've got to look at the problems socially and economically. We're talking about more money going to the NHS. Do we want all that money to be going to key workers just so they can afford to house themselves? What we do need is a balance between supply and demand. We need to make housing naturally affordable. And the only way by doing that is to make sure that local authorities supply
Overcome
sufficient homes.
NIMBYism, then?
Well, we do need to
All right.
overcome NIMBYism.
Michael Coogan, Gordon Brown pointed out mortgage rates lowest that they've been for 40 years. Lots of people want to buy their houses. Talked about Islamic mortgages. For the first time, the government has publicly endorsed this. That makes you happy, does it?
Yes, it is. I think we were
welcomed the recognition of the success of home ownership in the UK, and clearly one of the groups that have been excluded have been Islamic borrowers, so that they're...
Just to explain to people that they're not allowed to borrow money and pay interest.
Yes, for religious reasons they aren't allowed to borrow at interest rates above zero. So in effect what they've had to do is to sell the property to an institution that holds it. They are the tenant for a period of time, and then it's sold to them at the end of the mortgage term, and they pay rent during that period. The stamp duty therefore is paid twice, and what we've heard today is that that's going to be withdrawn, and they'll only have to pay once. But what we haven't heard today is other help for other first-time buyers. We were looking for the 60,000 limit to be increased.
All right, thank you very much. Well, there you have it, David. An overview of some of the pressing subjects in the government's in-tray.
Thanks, Zainab. Well, now let's find out what the voters think, how they're directly affected. We join Adrian Chiles.
Yes, thanks. We have our 24 budget barometers. They've been closely monitored to make sure they stayed awake through the whole thing. Did anybody fall asleep? Yes, we got a couple of nods from Manchester. Perhaps it's too hot in that particular studio. Let's go to Paul Thompson first in Manchester. How are you feeling, Paul?
Not too bad. Bit disappointed.
What's disappointed you?
Well, I've been hit again. Another soft touch, I suppose.
Right. Where have you been hit?
Basically in the pocket.
Right.
The booze has gone up, cigs have gone up.
Yeah.
So, soft touch, isn't it?
Far from it, actually, Paul. I do bring you glad tidings. We've worked it out. We've crunched your numbers in our computer, and over the whole year, you will be £1 better off. Any thoughts on how you might spend it?
I might give it to the MPs to pay for their shortfall in the pension schemes.
You've got no kids, and I know you feel quite strongly that a lot of people with kids get more benefits than you without.
Yeah.
Well, go on.
It's unfair. I mean, people choose to have the kids. I've chosen not to have the kids, and now I'm getting penalised for not having any.
OK. But you've got a greater disposable income because you haven't got kids, so we tax you more to help those who are raising kids who are the future, after all.
Well, the pot's only so deep, isn't it?
OK.
And it's getting to the bottom of the pot now.
OK. Thanks very much, Paul. Let's go to Pauline Clinton in Glasgow. Now, you're raising a child, Pauline. You're out of work at the moment. Do you feel any gratitude to the Chancellor? If Paul Thompson in Manchester is upset that people with kids are getting too many benefits, then presumably you're quite grateful.
Yes, I'm finding it that I'm quite grateful. It's sounding positive, and the incentive is there to return to the work. What we do need, though, is more employers incentives to actually employ more lone parents.
Mm-hmm. But you are £8 better off over the year. But I just wonder what argument you use against Paul, so to speak, to say, well, why should you get a bit more help with raising your children?
It's why shouldn't I? I found myself in the position of being a lone parent. It's not something that I set out to do. I do have the 2 children. I do bring them up. And yes, I do need all the help I can have. It's not. It's so expensive to bring children up in this day and age.
Thanks, Pauline. Simon Gompert, our pensions and benefits specialist, would have something to say about that. I mean, what good news could Pauline take?
Not a huge amount extra, although if she was to move into work, hopefully she might benefit from the extra flexibility over housing benefit. The problem is, if she needs childcare, when you're moving into work, you do get the benefit of that from the new tax credits, but only 70% of the childcare that you pay for. You'd still have to find the money for the 30% that's left over.
To Nottingham and Nigel Jackson. We spoke to you before, Nigel. You were a big loser last year in Nottingham, Nigel. How do you feel now? What do you make of what you've heard from the Chancellor?
Well, the main thing that I'm pleased to hear about was the increase in VAT, widening of the VAT margin for small businesses, because the more businesses that can pay the flat rate for VAT, I'm all in favour of. The thing that concerns me, though, is this thing that he mentioned, which was the publishing of the varied retail price indexes and inflation figures throughout the regions, because I can see that being used to his advantage in sharing the wealth on the public servants incorrectly.
Thanks for that, Nigel. Let's go to Sue Pepper, who is angry of Tunbridge Wells. Sue, what are you angry about?
It's a question of the incapacity benefit and the jobs for the disabled. Now, is this disabled jobs just for the sake of jobs, or are they actually really considering the disabilities of the disabled people themselves?
I mean, you ought to be a beneficiary. You're neutral this year. You haven't gained or lost, but you ought to be a beneficiary in your position of greater public spending, reliant as you may be on the NHS and so on.
Well, I don't feel that I'm benefiting at all, because I try to keep away from the medical profession as much as I can by swimming and doing gym. Yeah. Now, if I'm made to go back to work, then I will lose that. I will reduce my fitness. I will reduce my ability to be able to work. So therefore, I shall be calling more and more on the NHS.
Okay. That's a fair point, but I suppose we could all use that if we wanted to work less and go to the gym more. But anyway, well, I'll try and come back to you later on that. So very briefly, and I'll try and use you again, Mel, but Mel Richards from Swansea, who's in our Cardiff studio. Just your reaction briefly, Mel.
Well, I'm a little bit concerned about the housing benefit. What the Chancellor seemed to be describing was sort of a one-size-fits-all solution. And the thing is, a one-size-fits-all may work for the benefits, but it needs to be applied to a one-size-fits-all housing stock, which simply doesn't exist.
OK, we'll hear from you later, Mel. Thanks for that. David, back to you.
We have a chance now to hear Charles Kennedy, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, briefly from the House of Commons. This was his first reaction to the budget statement.
This, I think, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this afternoon has been an example, certainly, of a buck-passing budget, but also a cross your fingers and hope for the best budget. That is the reality of what the Chancellor has been up to. And indeed, when you look at the problems that we all encounter as constituency MPs at local level, the jobs that are being lost and the difficult sectors of the economy, not least manufacturing, there is a sense of denial about this amazing account that the Chancellor is able to give us, how every indicator puts us so well ahead of the pack internationally. And he should stop blaming the rest of the world, and he should feel rather chastened with this budget this year. Because at this time, British people are paying the price for mistakes, and they deserve more than excuses. The current problems are not simply down to the inevitable downturn that has taken place in the world economy, because the British economy has been doing significantly worse than many of our principal competitors. And that's proved by three key facts.
Charles Kennedy speaking in the House of Commons. We're joined by three politicians now: Ruth Kelly, Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Mark Oaten, Chairman of the Liberal Democrats, and Michael Howard, Shadow Chancellor, who'll get a chance to speak, I think, what, later today or tomorrow or 3 days from now?
I'm afraid not until Monday next week.
OK, speak your mind now. What would you have done different?
Oh, I wouldn't have started from here, and I would have encouraged hard-working families in this country. I would have encouraged people to save, and I would have created a climate in which business could really thrive. This is the second time in just 4 months that Gordon Brown has had to come to the House of Commons and admit that he's got his sums all wrong. He's downgraded all his forecasts, yet again. He's had to announce the most extraordinary increase in borrowing, £63 billion more than he forecast just 2 years ago over a 5-year period. That's an extra £2,600 for every household in the country.
But as he said, it's a lot less than you borrowed as Tories during your time in office.
If we want to go back over that, we can. Yeah, we were in the RM at the time, if you recall, and that was a great mistake, and I very much regret it. At least we've learned the lessons from that. If you want to talk about that, we can certainly talk about it. But today, what we've seen is a thoroughly discredited Chancellor, and what people are increasingly going to ask themselves is, can we trust our savings to this man?
Can I just ask you this question? We heard the Prime Minister say during Prime Minister's questions what he always says: you, the Tories, want to make 20% cuts across the board. That's really the secret.
It's rubbish. It's completely untrue. It's absolute rubbish, and we've said so time and time again. And it's a great pity that we can't have a serious, grown-up debate about these things, a grown-up debate about how we should deliver our public services in this country, how they should be financed, how they should be paid for, what they should cost. That's the sort of debate grown-up politicians should be having, instead of throwing slogans of this kind across the dispatch box,
hang on,
as the Prime Minister always does.
He lays his glove on you because Ian Duncan Smith said it just after Christmas last year.
He was talking about cuts in the costs of administration Now, the costs of administration have actually already gone up more than 25% since this government came to office, and I don't think you'll find many people who would deny that there's certainly scope for savings there.
Okay,
but we're not talking about savings on
cut?
frontline
okay,
services.
You say he's got his figures wrong. What kind of cut do you want to see in government spending?
We've had
what sort of percentage cut?
We don't have a percentage target, but we
No
do
target,
want to
any
cut out. We
target?
want to cut out waste where
but any target for
we
it?
have huge numbers of bureaucrats. For the first time, for example, now we have more bureaucrats than beds in the National Health Service. Does anybody think that's a sensible state of affairs?
Ruth Kelly?
I find it extraordinary that Michael Howard starts by saying he wouldn't like to start from here. I think it's perhaps wise to point out that at the time when the world economy suffered its sharpest downturn for 30 years, Britain has actually had the lowest inflation rate for 30 years, the lowest interest rates for 40 years, and the longest sustained period of growth for 50 years. That is quite a remarkable economic performance.
And what about a Chancellor who's got it wrong yet again?
Well, at a time when all other countries are massively revising down their forecasts, the Chancellor is predicting growth in the United Kingdom this year of 2 to 2.5%, rising to 3 to 3.5% the following year, returning to trend. So, in effect, what the Chancellor has set out today is a fairly reasonable outlook for the United Kingdom economy at a time when all of our major competitors and 20 out of 22 industrialised nations have been in recession.
Not fairly reasonable is a curious expression. Mark Oaten, what do you make of it? I should just say, listening to this, Alex Salmond of the SNP and Elvin Cloyd of Plaid Cymru, I hope, and we'll go to them in just a moment. But Mark Oaten, the Liberal Democrat position seems to be, I read your documents on it, you wanted a 1% increase in tax. You got it last Sunday with a 1% increase in national insurance. You now want further increases in spending and further increases in tax. So you are the top tax and spend party. Perhaps you're proud of that.
Well, what I would like to see is the 1% that we have come through being spent much better. And frankly, most people watching this budget will be somewhat bemused. The figures will be something they just don't really understand. What they will understand is when they get their pay packet in a few weeks' time, it will have extra money taken out. What they need to see down on the ground is the hip operation for their aunt. They want to see their kids in decent schools, and they want to see crime being tackled. And I think the concern the Lib Dems have is that, having argued for that money, how is it actually being spent? And we would want some fundamental reforms to make sure that money is being spent. And in addition, yes, we would have a small tax increase for those earning over 100,000, and what we would do with that would be abolish tuition fees and also make changes to council tax, because those are two big taxes which are hidden there, affecting quite a few people.
Okay, Alex Salmond, leader in the House of Commons of the SNP, there was a lot of talk about help to the regions and nations. Is that how you see this budget?
Well, there's a lot of talk about it. I didn't actually see much delivery on that. I mean, the central message of the budget is borrowing up, growth forecast down. What was the old phrase? Blown off course. That would be the central message of this budget.
What would you like to have seen then that didn't happen?
Well, it's something substantial. I mean, Gordon Brown spoke for about 5 minutes about what he was going to do for the regions and nations, and as far as I could see, he was re-announcing something he'd announced 6 months ago, these enterprise areas. He was going to devolve more power to social security offices. Now, I mean, these may be quite good things, but they're not the sort of measure which is going to attack the low growth record just now of the Scottish economy. And remember, the Scottish economy has been in technical recession over the last year. And I would have wanted to see a Chancellor prepared to do something about it. I mean, Gordon Brown may sit for a Scottish constituency, but he's no Scottish Chancellor.
No, he did freeze whisky duties.
Oh, well, we all approve of that, David. And there was some important help for the North Sea oil industry in taking PRT off existing infrastructure, a very important measure. But nonetheless, only undoing some of the great damage he did to North Sea oil and gas last year with the tax increase, which has cost thousands of jobs. So I welcome the remission. I think he should have done a bit more, given how much he gets in every year. And the only thing Gordon Brown can rely on these days is these oil and gas revenue forecasts, which are going up 5 or 6 billion a year at the present moment. You'd think he'd show a bit more gratitude, David.
Elvin Cloyd, he did say that the government was approaching full employment, or hoped to approach full employment, and mentioned the nations and Wales among them. Do you think what he's done is good enough for Wales?
Well, there's nothing in it for Wales. There's nothing for manufacturing, despite some kind words. There's nothing for rural areas, nothing at all for agriculture. Frankly, talking about moving jobs out of the southeast to the less prosperous regions, including the country of Wales, isn't much good. Talk doesn't help at all. Of the good things that he mentioned, there are 5 reviews that he announced today. Those are grabbing the headlines and then being kicked into the long grass. We don't expect to see much come of that. Frankly, this was a threadbare budget by a rather tarnished Iron Chancellor.
Well, there's discontent in Scotland and Wales. We don't have an English representative here, but Ruth Kelly, what do you say to them?
Well, I mean, they're saying there's nothing for the regions. In fact, this was a budget about increasing productivity in the regions and closing the gaps between productivity rates in the most prosperous regions and those in the least advantaged areas. And one way the Chancellor is doing that is today announcing that he's able to abolish stamp duty rates in 2,000 enterprise zones across the country. In other ways, he's supporting the manufacturing base, introducing and expanding the research and development tax credit. He's now consulting how he can make it, as it were, more attractive to business. He's also consulting on ways of helping small businesses to grow, access to finance, for example.
Okay, Andrew, how strong a message do you think that will be to the SNP and Plaid Cymru? Well, or indeed to, well, there isn't an English National Party, but to the rest of England.
We just heard, I was just thinking just now, that if there was a kind of a slogan for these programmes, there's nothing in it for Wales, might be something that we hear year after year after year. It's a kind of part of the ritual now. Nonetheless...
go on. I was going to say, is it true, but...
Well, what is clearly true is that Gordon Brown's instincts are to push more economic power to the regions and to try to break up national pay bargaining and so on, to get better productivity. Productivity is the great problem in the British economy at the moment, has been for a very, very long time, and is still relatively poor. There's lots of things where Britain is doing quite well compared to other countries. Productivity ain't one of them. Okay. So it's clear that that's what he wants to do. But as with everything else, you know, the numbers involved and the timing is slightly disappointing this year. It's not a big budget for announcements, it's not a big budget for new money. This is the budget of a Chancellor who has really set his course in terms of the big issues, above all for the next few years. He set his course last year, not much he can do this year.
DeAnne Julius, what do you make of what the political take on this budget is and what you've heard the 5 politicians that are with us say?
Well, I think it's true that this is not a big budget. On the other hand, that is a bit of a relief. The deficits have not ballooned, at least in his calculations, as far as some of us feared. Now, those calculations, we'll see whether they come about or not, but things could have been worse. I think at the micro level, the Chancellor has had a nasty habit of tinkering. Creating red tape, doing things which actually introduce distortions into the economy, perhaps for the best of reasons, but perhaps not with the best of results. So the fact that this was a short budget, and indeed short on measures, is in a sense good news, I think, for many people.
What do you make of that, Michael Howard?
Well, Andrew says that this is a Chancellor who set his course, and I think that's absolutely right. The trouble is it's a course that's heading us for the rocks. Digby James, the Director General of the CBI, not very long ago, said we were sleepwalking to decline. And if you look at things like productivity, which Andrew mentioned, our productivity growth has halved since this government came to office. The Chancellor tried to compare our productivity with the United States. We were actually narrowing the productivity gap with the United States in the last 5 years of Conservative government. It's widened again in the first 5 or 6 years of this government. If you look at business investment, it's fallen off a cliff. It's fallen at the second sharpest rate since records were first kept in 1963.
Is that true, Ruth Kelly, from your point of view?
Well, it's a fact.
Much higher today than it was when we came to power in 1997, and it's fallen exactly in line with what's happened in the United States. Michael Howard just doesn't have a point.
She doesn't deny the fact I put, which is true.
But the spin you put, she does deny.
Well, I merely recited a fact. It has fallen at the second sharpest rate since records were first kept in 1963. And that's very serious for anyone who cares about the future course of the British economy.
Okay, Marco.
An additional concern I have is that there is clear evidence that we seem to be losing out on inward investment coming into this country. That has fallen considerably, and that's a long-term problem. And when you consider that this budget appears to have kicked the euro into the long grass, I have severe concerns about the impact that decision will have on investment decisions that people are taking about where they put their money. This country country is going to lose out in the next 5 years unless we tackle this euro issue.
Okay. Evan, just before I bring you in, you might like to comment on some of these comments from people watching. There's a question about the Child Trust Fund and a question about children, which I want to put to you later on. But so once again, under this government, it's the childless couple in the middle classes who get clobbered, roll on the election.
More or less correct. Although the Chancellor has put money towards poorer childless couples with the working tax credit. I know no one understands these things, but the working tax credit does direct benefits to working poor couples.
By keeping income tax allowances the same and not increasing by inflation, David Farnborough says, the poorer people are now being taxed more than at the last budget. True, false?
That is a tax increase. A lot of low-income households will more than make up for that in the tax credits handouts. However, it is absolutely true that more people are being brought into the tax net with the freezing of allowances.
How big a pay rise do I need just to stand still? But
that one I
Jane of Leicester doesn't say what she's earning, so that's not so good. And how can it take an hour to deliver so little? I don't know. You can answer that one for us too.
David, I think what's interesting about the political discussion that you've had is that the story of Gordon Brown's chancellorship is, in the honeymoon period for Labour in the first Parliament, he made some very difficult decisions and raised taxes. In the second half of the first Parliament, everything was going very well, and it was very easy to satisfy every constituency. Public services, business, the Middle England, as we like to call them, redistribution to the poor. That was very easy because you'd made those tough decisions in the first half of the Parliament. Now the money is not coming in as he hoped. It's very hard to satisfy all these constituencies. Okay. Holding that coalition together is going to be a very difficult challenge for him.
And certainly hard to satisfy Elvin Cloyd of Plaid Cymru. What would you have had him do, Elvin?
I would have had a proper structured regional policy towards moving manufacturing, getting manufacturing back on its feet in Wales, but also being able to secure the movement of some high value jobs from the southeast towards Wales. He's mentioned that this is up for review. People are looking at it, but frankly, the divide between the GDP in Wales and the rest of the UK still is shockingly big. It's closed very slightly recently, but it's still alarmingly big. That's why we've got Objective 1 for most of the country.
So you would have had a transfer of funds from the southeast, for instance, to Wales?
Well, that's exactly what the Chancellor says he's reviewing on, but it's one of 5 relatively good things which he is reviewing on, and I don't hold much hope that we'll see much evidence of it in the coming next 2 years or so.
Alex Salmond, why are you so sceptical about reviews? You said they get kicked into the long grass.
Well, when you're having reviews, that's when you don't want to actually do anything, so you announce a review to get the publicity impact without taking the bang in terms of the bucks you have to spend. But, I'd do all what Elvin says. I'd also lower corporation tax in Scotland and Wales to match the levels that now prevail in independent Ireland. And one thing Andrew Marr said, which is crucially important, Andrew talked about devolution of power through regional pay bargaining. If I'm a nurse or a doctor or a teacher or a firefighter in Scotland, Wales and English regions watching this programme, what I know is the Chancellor of the Exchequer wants to lower my wages and increase the wages of people in the South East in the public sector. Now, the problem with that, our analysis of the Scottish Health Service shows that you have to pay nurses more in order to solve the problems of the health service. So in the middle of an election campaign in Scotland, where we're trying to pay nurses 11% more, Gordon Brown is setting his cap on paying nurses and other public sector workers in the regions and nations less.
Okay. Ruth Kelly, just one point. I did mention that we had about children in the emails. There was a lot of talk about whether you would increase the child element in child tax credit. The IFS say that not having increased it this budget, you won't hit your abolition of child poverty target that Gordon Brown always says is central.
Well, we're about halfway towards meeting our targets in about half the time. So effectively we're on track to meet those targets, and of course there will be a review as to how we can push that forward in years to come. But one of the things we have been able to do in this budget, because as Evan rightly pointed out of the tough decisions made since 1997, is think about the entire next generation of children just being born, setting up the Child Trust Fund. It's based on a principle called progressive universalism, which means basically that everybody has a stake, but that poorer children get more money put into an initial endowment by the government. And then at the age of 18, as that builds up and additional contributions are made, they'll actually be able to have opportunities that other people take for granted at the moment.
And unlike a lot of these benefits, do you think there will be a pickup on this? Do you think people will actually
It'll be totally universal
do the paperwork and all the rest of it?
linked to child benefit. So there should be no reason why anybody shouldn't take advantage of this new opportunity.
When you get it, you pay your tuition fees.
Okay, we'll come back in a moment. Vicky Young is on the green outside the Houses of Lords, actually, the Houses of Parliament, with some of the people who will be interpreting this for tomorrow's press. Vicky.
That's right, David. The budget does remain one of those big parliamentary occasions which does guarantee MPs get in there bright and early to get their seats. It does guarantee a full House, but there's no question a more muted atmosphere, I think, today in the House of Commons. And to reflect on that with me, I have two journalists who'll be writing about this for tomorrow's papers. Michael White from The Guardian, Quentin Letts will be writing for the Daily Mail. First of all, Michael, do you agree that it was a more sober feeling in the House of Commons?
You're being much too kind. It wasn't sober, it was boring. And when Chancellors of the Exchequer, and I've seen a few, deliberately try and bore you down, you know they're up to something, and I just think he wanted to take the edge off it. He's done a number of interesting things, nothing very dramatic. I couldn't see a theme in it except economic growth, social justice, familiar things with Gordon Brown, but his borrowing and his tax projections and his public spending ones, they're the ones that are going to cause trouble, and that's, I think, he tried to bore us away from that.
So, Quentin Letts, do you agree with that? You've got to write a sketch tomorrow for the newspaper. Anything funny
I've got
in
to
that?
chisel one out. Yeah, I looked around at one point. I think I counted 5 MPs who, to all intents and purposes, I think were asleep.
Their names have been taken.
One of them was standing up as well, like a horse in a meadow. So I think it was very sotto and subdued and dull. Dull. He went on too long as well. I mean, a good sub-editor, I think, could have got it down to about 20 minutes. But he went on for a whole hour. Agony.
Do you agree that he did that intentionally?
Oh, I don't. He quite likes speaking and quite likes, after all this war business, he wanted a bit of prime time maybe. But he didn't seem to have much to say and was just going to take our time up doing it anyway.
Michael, do you think much of this was to do with the background of war?
It was part of it and explains some of the sort of dampening of growth. He said how terrifically well we are doing compared with our major competitors. By and large, that's true, actually. And he did do a few things. He didn't tax us a great deal more, a bit on
He's already done that,
fags.
though, hasn't he?
Yeah, that's right, coming in from last year. And right towards the end, he got the Labour benches going. He saved the best for the end. The baby bond, as we call it, the child tax little pot for all children to make it fairer for those who don't have anything. He abolished hotel charges for old people who get their pension docked when they go into hospital. Labour people waived their order papers just to show they were still awake then. What else did he do? He gave us a clue on the euro, because he's going to fiddle with mortgages so to make it easier for us to go in the euro, but not yet.
But the euro decision wasn't there. That would have livened things up a bit if there had been something like that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, he didn't seem to have anything really major to say, and some of it was fairly sort of familiar old soup, the baby bond stuff. I think we've heard quite a lot of that before.
Yeah, it hadn't actually happened up to now.
I don't know. This was a budget that somehow could have just not happened, and we'd have all been much the same position, I got the impression.
And he is quite a good Commons performer, though, isn't he, Gordon Brown?
Normally, yes, he stumbled a bit today. There were a few more stumbles than normal, but I mean, he still, when he stands up, you know that this is a big man and that he's an important man. But today, he didn't have the message for it.
He did make one good joke. He's with whiskey. He's not going to put the tax up to make it more compatible with Europe. He's been not doing that for years, and he said it'll help every whiskey producer in England.
You see, I think
It's a Scotsman's joke.
But I think he made that joke last year.
It made me laugh.
He made that joke last year. OK, thank you very much. So that's what you'll be reading a bit about in the papers tomorrow. That's the assessment from the old Fleet Street, if you like, for the budget for Mr Brown.
Thanks so much. I rather liked him getting 1 and 5, 15%, which I thought was, he'd been taught to say. I don't think he's a bingo player, probably. Adrian, you said we were going to get hand gestures from your families and their response to the budget. I'm looking forward to them. Over to you.
Editorial Policy have been on the line to us and told us to be very careful with the hand gestures, but we'll finish the programme with them, David. You won't be disappointed. Let's go back to our budget barometers. We'll start with Alistair in Nottingham. He said he's a Derby County fan, so he's used to disappointment. But you want to make a point about the tax bans, Alistair?
Yes, Adrian. The Chancellor's raised the threshold of inheritance tax by less than the rate of inflation. Given that people's main asset is their home, which is raised by 40% in the last 12 months, isn't this a tax-raising initiative by the Chancellor? And can people avoid it by making a living will, perhaps into these new child benefits that the Chancellor's talking about?
OK, Alistair, thanks. John Whiting's our tax specialist here.
He's absolutely right in that inheritance tax is being used as a nice, subtle, stealthy tax raiser. The yield is definitely going up over the years. Just subtly in his speech, he admitted to it. Last year, he said 96% of people dying don't pay inheritance tax. This year, 95%. If you think about it, it may not sound much, but the numbers going up are actually quite significant. And it is housing that's getting in. Very difficult for people to take action. It is possible, but giving it to the kids with care.
OK, just move on to another one of our experts, Simon, on pensions. What good news would you say was in there for pensioners?
A couple of quite important things. First of all, pensioners going into hospital have had their state retirement pension reduced for meal and accommodation costs up until now. That's going to stop. And secondly, when you reach the age of 80, you will get £100 extra winter fuel payment. So that's effectively a £100 increase in the pension when you reach that age. So a couple of small points, but important ones.
George Henderson in Glasgow. As a pensioner, how would you react to what Simon said? There was some good news there. Are you beside yourself with gratitude?
Yeah, we welcome that. We're very pleased about that, but we're very upset and disappointed that the failure to restore the link with average earnings has been missed. And we're very angry about the means-tested benefits. It's very demeaning and intrusive. And there's many pensioners who don't fill the forms in and don't claim, and it's very bureaucratic. We're very angry about that.
Simon just wants to come back. Go on, Simon.
It's a crucial point. There are over 600,000 pensioners who have not claimed the minimum income guarantee. That's an income of around £100 a week that they could go up to when they qualify for it. And they haven't. Now the pension credit is coming in later on this year, which will be similar. And the question is how many people will claim that? That again is means tested. They have to put in a claim.
Let's go to Brian Barrow in Nottingham. Brian, what's your point?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting when you take a look at the budget from the low side of society. There's a saying that when you want to know how well your country is doing, you look at the lower members of society. And I think that a lot of the aspects of the budget has been basically directed, or the lowest members of society are not being considered. I think education also, which is a field that I work in, has been basically ignored. And some of the finer factors or detailed aspects of education need to be attended to. I mean, you mentioned healthcare, and healthcare is important, and I think education also works hand in hand.
You're one of the few people who's ever moved from New York to Nottingham, I would venture to suggest. How has your tax burden changed from New York to Nottingham? Do you pay less in Nottingham?
Less? No, I pay much more taxes here in the United Kingdom. In the US, the tax rate is, in New York in particular, is 8.25%, which is basically small in comparison to what you do pay here.
But it pays for the NHS, which is free at point of view, so that's something you get for your money with your higher taxes in Nottingham.
Yeah, you get free. You might get free health service, but then how efficient is the health service?
OK. It's a fair point. Brian, thanks. To Josh in Tunbridge Wells. You've got a question for Christine, I believe, Josh.
Yeah, a quick question about, Mr Brown was talking about the possibility of having fixed interest mortgages, looking into that. I'm just wondering if that's actually realistic, and if, maybe a few years down the line, we might be seeing it, in high street branches around the country.
OK, hold on, please. Josh, go on, Christine.
I think, Josh, it's certainly possible seeing it in high street branches. It's, I suppose, an issue as to why the government's getting involved with this, but they have tried to reform financial services. And if they can do something that makes it easier for lenders, banks and building societies to deliver these products efficiently, that gives more certainty to home buyers that they're not going to get caught out if rates go up dramatically.
OK, to John Mordy in Newcastle. Now, you're a non-smoker, so why would it bother you, John, that cigarette prices have gone up?
I know it might sound a very odd thing for a non-smoker to say, but it is going to affect everyone, I feel, in that the Chancellor's been very short-sighted. I not only think cigarette prices should have been frozen, they should have been dropped, and as a non-smoker, again, very odd, but in Newcastle and in any major town, city, village, you can come across contraband cigarettes very easily. And I feel people feel morally justified in getting their hands on these goods, these cigarettes, and I feel that the Exchequer is going to suffer in the long term.
OK, there's a kind of a contraband culture.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, you're not comfortable living in that. No. Let's stay in Newcastle. Go to John Austin. John, local job seekers, job centres are going to be given more flexibility. There won't be national rules, there'll be local rules, so they'll be able to give you, for example, more funding to go to a particular interview. They'll have more flexibility. Is that going to help?
Well, definitely it'll help me in the long run.
if they say they're going to do what they're going to do, and you don't have to go through all this red tape to get your money back. Like, for example, you've got to show them a ticket first before they'll give you the money. Like, so, you know, if you've got to go for a job and you haven't got the money, how are you going to go to the job? If you can prove you're going for a job, then surely they should give you the money before you go for the job and not after.
OK,
So
well, good luck finding a job, John. Let's go to Cardiff and Maggie. Now, Maggie, your income, as I remember, is something like £6,500. You've got 4 kids. There's a separate television programme altogether on how you manage to make ends meet. But just tell me this. In raising your children, if you'd had this baby bond, if you'd been given this £250 or £500 lump sum when they were born, what difference would that have made? Would the kids, as has been intended, be keener to save and realise they needed to develop a nest egg and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's a good incentive for saving for the future, but how it helps families immediately, it doesn't really, you know, it's not going to really help. £250 to £500 is a drop in the ocean compared to the price of bringing up a family. What I was more interested in is the child tax credit and how that's enabling families to be able to go back to studying and come off income support, and I thought that was a great incentive for the budget for me this year.
OK, so you give a broad thumbs up when it comes to the hand signals?
Yeah, I think I would.
OK, all right. We'll talk very briefly again before the end of the programme. Thank you all very much. Back to David.
Thanks, Adrian. Now, Zainab.
David, thank you. Yes, we're going to take a quick look at education. What did the Chancellor say about education? Nothing new, pledged no extra money, but reminded us that he's putting £15 billion by 2006 in education. William Atkinson, you're head of a big secondary school here in London. Why are you still talking about a funding crisis in secondary education? Lots of money you're getting.
I wish that was the case. The reality on the ground is that many schools up and down the country are facing shortfalls in their budget of hundreds of thousands of pounds directly as a result of measures announced last year by the Chancellor. So instead of looking forward to increase investment in education, in our schools, in our classroom, in our teachers, we are having to make cuts, and the cuts which will threaten standards that we've been working very hard to
What are you spending the money on, though?
We're spending money and doing all of those things that the government wants us to do, which is to raise standard, which is to work more effectively with our teachers and our students, to use adults other than teachers to support the teachers, to support the children's learning, buying books and buying equipment.
Higher staff costs too, though?
Oh, absolutely. As a result
of
of national insurance increases, the pension increases, these have been significant contributing factors. In addition to that, if you work in Inner London, there is an Inner London Pay Award, which has had significant costs, which have not been fully funded. So at the end of the day, we're significantly worse off in terms of what we've got to spend on our institution than was the case a year ago. Right. And that needs to be understood by everyone across this nation.
Chris Weaver's NUS, National Union of Students, also very unhappy. Funding crisis you talk about in universities. It's quite right then that students should pay top-up fees, isn't it?
Well, the problem is it's a contradiction in the terms of the government policy. The government wants to widen participation, encourage people from less well-off backgrounds into higher education, and there's a commitment given within the Chancellor's speech to lifelong learning. These proposals by the government to charge the fees are going to completely undermine that policy. It's decades of underfunding that's resulted in this problem, and it's government funding that needs to dig us back out again.
Gentlemen, thank you. Well, 2 disappointed voices from education, David.
Thanks very much. Well, now, last moment, DeAnne, your reaction to this budget overall?
Overall,
your headline view of it.
It was best for small business. That's the best news. The worst news is it didn't admit to the kind of tax increases we've already had imposed on us this year, and it didn't admit that we'll need more next year.
Evan Davies.
2 new things to come out of this. Flexibility is the new stability. I think Gordon Brown mentioned flexibility multitude of times. That's part of his emphasis. The other thing, a very big issue to come up in next year's spending review, child poverty targets. Gordon Brown's launched an inquiry. That's what he did over health. Before he put lots of money into health, he's going to put a lot of money into meeting those child poverty targets. That's a big new commitment on public spending for next year, I predict.
Andy?
Well, it wasn't a roar of a budget. It was a bit more of a sort of self-deprecating cough of a budget, and I slightly wonder if Gordon Brown didn't have to produce a budget this year, whether he'd have actually bothered. And I think it will have disappointed a lot of us political nutters here at Westminster, but it may well have relieved the rest of the country.
OK. And Adrian Chiles, last word from you.
From our expert, Simon, on pensions and benefits.
Well, if Gordon Brown was a cook, this was the budget he prepared earlier, put in the chiller last year for us to consume now.
Very nicely done. You've been practising that, Christy?
Not much for savers, a bit of an empty budget, but at least the Child Trust Fund arrived.
OK, and John, our accountant.
A few tweaks and twiddles, net take to his coffers with things like stamp duty, but not a lot.
OK. John, thanks very much. Finally, I'd just like to thank all our 24 budget barometers for staying with us. Now, the aforementioned hand signals. Could you, if you are pleased with what the Chancellor has done for you today, with what you've heard, could you raise your arm now, please, if you're pleased? Very good. That's 3. 4. 4. She's just decided the last minute. If you don't know, can you put your hands up? There we go. A few don't knows. And what about if you're displeased with the Chancellor, with Gordon Brown, what he's done today? There you go. I think the displease having a couple of thumbs down from Manchester. Best of luck with everything you do. Thanks very much indeed. David, back to you.
Thanks very much. We couldn't see them in close-up quite, those signs, but they all seem to be perfectly proper thumbs-ups or downs. Well, now, talking of this budget, there is more budget coverage for viewers with satellite or Freeview if you want it. You press the red button now, you get another chance to hear the speeches from the House of Commons, if you can bear it. From 3:30 this afternoon, you'll be able to find out the full details of the effect of the budget on those families that Adrian Chiles had with him. If you want to find out what the budget actually means to you, you can try our budget calculator at bbc.co.uk/budget. And if you've got questions on the budget, there's always Moneybox Live, Radio 4, tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. From all of us here, good afternoon.
$32,000 finished last year's London Marathon.